Good morning. As the Secretary of the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee, it is my pleasure to call this meeting to order. We are excited to welcome you to the second EMAC meeting of 2024 being held at the University of Missouri, Kansas City in Kansas City, Missouri. I would like to welcome all of our returning EMAC members, associate members, and subcommittee members, and our new associate member, Annette Hugh. And of course, our EMAC Chair, Dina Wiggins. I would also like to thank all the commission staff. And as we say every time, it takes a village. It really does. So I really appreciate all the help. As usual, today's meeting is taking place in hybrid fashion. Several participants are here in person, but several also on the phone. So to ensure that the meeting goes as smoothly as possible and the recording of the meeting is complete and accurate, please note the following. If you're in person and you'd like to begin to be recognized during today's discussion, please place your name card so that it sits vertically on the table. Before you speak, please identify yourself and the organization that you represent. If you're participating virtually and would like to be recognized during the discussion for a question or comment, please identify yourself before you begin speaking and signal when you are done. Please speak directly into your phone for optimal audio quality on the webcast. Unmute your Zoom video before you speak and mute after you speak. Please only turn your camera on when you're engaging in the Q&A after the panel. If you are disconnected from Zoom or need other technical assistance, please close your browser, or you can also link me in the chat. Before we begin this morning's discussions, I would like to turn to Commissioner Johnson for her opening remarks. Commissioner Johnson?
Good morning, everyone. Lauren, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Excellent. I'm joining you this morning from another university campus. I'm at NYU, and we're celebrating the launch of a book that will explore the applications of AI across our society. So I lament that I couldn't be there with you guys today in Kansas City. I'll see many of you later today or tomorrow, and am hopeful that we will have an exceptional conference there in Kansas City. So from one university campus to another, good morning. I'm thankful to everyone who has helped organize and coordinate this meeting, Commissioner Mersinger, Secretary Lauren Falks, backup secretaries John Mark LaBuffa and Lillian Cardona, and the members of EMAC who are so gracious to join today in person or virtually for this EMAC meeting. The agenda today includes many critical topics, including the future of power markets and the path to attaining net zero carbon in the United States. For me, the questions surrounding power markets are critical, but also very personal. My family, many of you know, my parents are in Dallas, Texas, and during Winter Storm Uri a few years ago, my sister, who supports one of the largest public hospitals in the country, and her staff and colleagues spent nights sleeping on cots at the hospital to ensure that surgeries continued around the clock in light of the power outages that deeply impacted much of Texas during that time. Therefore, the issues couldn't be more critical or timely, and I couldn't be more grateful that EMAC is turning to these questions. Legislation implemented under the direction of President Biden, including the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, have drastically improved the incentives to invest in energy markets. These legislative acts have awarded billions of dollars to promote grid reliability, resiliency, and energy efficiency. As the Biden administration has reported in the year following the passage of the IRA, quote, companies have announced more than $110 billion in new clean energy manufacturing investments, including more than $70 billion in the EV supply chain and more than $10 billion in solar manufacturing. Growing demand for electric vehicles, coupled with the growth of energy-intensive AI centers, is leading to an increased need for electricity to power these new technologies. We must ensure that our infrastructure can grow along with new demand, while still allowing us to reach our sustainability goals, including net zero carbon emissions. The developments also come as new environmental markets are forming, including the market for carbon credits. Many of you will know that over the last few weeks, I traveled to Southern Africa, specifically Zambia, to be on site, boots on the ground, exploring the reality of the potential of some carbon offset projects. Carbon credits are a novel way to provide incentives to parties to reduce carbon emissions, putting a price tag on those emissions, and ensuring that through our efforts at the CFTC, we can see or help to create transparent, liquid, public, and trustworthy markets. There is much work to be done. Therefore, the work you're undertaking today in Kansas City couldn't be more crucial, as I mentioned at the outset, or more important. Tackling the effects of drought As I mentioned, in Southern Africa in particular, there was extensive evidence of tremendous drought across our nation, and transitioning to carbon neutral power sources is going to take a whole of government approach and a whole of society approach. I look forward to hearing from so many of you today regarding how EMAC members can help advance this critical aim. Thank you so much, Commissioner Mersinger and Secretary Faulds.
Thank you, Commissioner Johnson. Commissioner Mercier, I turn to you.
Thanks, and welcome everyone to Kansas City, Missouri. I will note we were on the Missouri side. Many of us will be spending more time on the Kansas side tomorrow and the next day, so I'm happy that we were able to kind of split our time here. And definitely want to say thank you to our host, the University of Missouri, Kansas City. This is a very cool area and a beautiful campus, so I'm glad we're getting to experience that. And I'm glad that we're able to have this meeting in conjunction with the EdCon, an annual tradition for the CFTC that we had to kind of put aside for the last few years because of COVID. And thankful that the chairman has decided to pick that back up and continue the tradition of holding EdCon here in the Kansas City area. And hopefully many of you will be able to join us for that conference as well. So if you've noticed in any of my speeches, I'm a bit of a history nerd. A bigger history nerd is Chris Lucas, my chief of staff. And sometimes we try to outdo each other as far as what we can put into a speech. Recently, I gave a whole speech that focused around why there's a silent H at the end of the name of the city named Pittsburgh. Today, Chris helped a lot with this speech, and we are going to focus on art history in the Midwest. So this is exciting, but as Sinclair Lewis, another kind of Midwestern, cultural icon, he was the first American novelist to win a Nobel Prize in literature. He observed that every state has its own historical treasures, small, precious, and mislaid. The same may be said about this city, which boldly calls itself the Paris on the Plains. If you didn't know that, now you do. Here in Kansas City, Missouri, the life and art of Thomas Hart Benton is one of those mislaid treasures. So in 1934, Thomas Hart Benton became the first American painter to appear on the cover of Time magazine as the leading proponent of a new style of painting called American regionalism. Today, you might not know who Benton was, but if you don't, you surely know his regionalist colleague, Grant Wood, and Wood's famous painting, American Gothic. So in the 1930s, Grant Wood from Iowa, John Stuart Curry from Kansas, and Thomas Hart Benton from Missouri made up what was called the American Regionalist Triumvirate. They all studied and lived for periods of time outside the Midwest, but as Wood said in defense of their travels, I had to go to France to appreciate Iowa. They fought nationally and internationally for the idea that in an art world dominated by Paris and New York, there was a place for artists who lived and worked and depicted American subjects like Wood's pitchfork-holding Iowa farmer and his daughter. So among our this is going to come around. It makes sense, I promise. So among our financial regulatory peers, I like to think of the CFTC as taking a similar path. In an industry dominated by large cities and financial concerns, the CFTC was created to protect and give a voice to the people who live in places like Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri, not to mention my home state of South Dakota. And like the CFTC, Benton also straddled several different worlds. He was born in the small town of Neosho, Missouri. I probably said that wrong, in 1889. But after his father was elected to Congress, he spent his early years moving back and forth from Missouri and Washington, D.C., before being placed in a military academy in anticipation of a future career in politics. But after disappointing his family by becoming an artist instead of a politician, Benton studied in Chicago and Paris before achieving his long-deserved success in New York. In 1935, he did something truly radical. He left New York for Missouri and returned home to teach at Kansas City Art Institute, where he remained until his death in 1975. Thomas Hart Benton's art focused on everyday people and moments in life across America, a focus we are striving to achieve the work of this advisory committee as well. One of our 4 panelists will examine the current state of the crude oil derivatives markets. Painting in the 1920s and 30s, oil was a subject of fascination for Benton. In 1928, he traveled to Borger, I probably said that wrong, Borger, Texas, to see the spectacle of a town and industry quickly cropping up around the discovery of crude oil. From that trip came his painting Boomtown, which in his memoir, An Artist in America, Benton described by saying, out on the open plains beyond the town, a great thick column of black smoke rose as in a volcanic eruption from the earth to the middle of the sky. Today, we will also learn about construction of our electric grid and the cost of large-scale electrification, which will further inform our work on derivatives markets for electric power. Electric power was also a subject of interest for Benton. In his manual, Instruments of Power, which is currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Arts, he depicted everything from power plants and hydroelectric dams to high-tension wires and gas turbines. Also, after EMAC's discussion of the proposed Basel III endgame at our last meeting, a committee member requested that we devote some time to some different views on the implementation of Basel III. To that end, we have a panel that discusses the endgame, but from a different perspective that is more supportive of the Federal Reserve's current proposal. As I've said previously, we should not shy away from discussing difficult issues where we have differing viewpoints. And I firmly believe, and I try to teach this to my children, that we are all better informed when we understand and appreciate all sides of an issue. So back to our art history here. Sadly, a few painters have taken the time to depict the intricacies of bank capital standards. And even Thomas Hart Benton, who somehow conveniently painted something about everything else we're talking about today, did not paint about financial regulations. But his father did serve in Congress. He was a populist in the tradition of William Jennings Bryan and an ardent opponent of large banks and industrialists. So he may have been very sympathetic to our endgame panelists' point of view. In addition, we will receive further progress reports on our subcommittees from, I believe John Mark is going to handle the update for Professor Lang. And I believe Professor Fitzgerald is with us to give us an update on the Physical Energy Infrastructure Subcommittee. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to recognize EMAC's own triumvirate of dedicated staff, Secretary Laura Folks, and our subcommittee secretaries, John Mark Buffa, as well as Lillian Cardona, who is not here, but I believe she might be joining us virtually. And of course, recognize EMAC Chair Dina Wiggins. And to recognize our newest associate member, Annette Hugh from S&P Global Commodity Insights. Thank you to our members and our associate members and guests for attending today, and I look forward to another informative meeting.
Thank you, Commissioner Mersinger. I'll turn it over to Dina.
Thank you, and thank you for the art history lesson. That was an added bonus to what we get to learn today. I didn't realize we were going to have art history to talk about, but that was fascinating. I appreciate that. And thank you, Commissioner, for having this here in Kansas City. I've never been to Kansas City before. Had a chance to walk around the plaza last night. It was lovely. So thank you for bringing us to different places in addition to having meetings in DC. The committee serves an important vehicle to discuss matters of concern to hedgers, consumers, exchanges, firms, and end users within our energy and environmental markets, as well as the Commission's regulation of these markets. There'll be 4 panels today with prepared presentations, and then following the panel presentations, there'll be a time for discussion. As chair, I look forward to facilitating that discussion and making sure that we abide by the rules that we're supposed to abide by to facilitate this discussion. And to ensure that we are consistent with the EMAC charter, which prohibits associate members from providing reports and recommendations directly to the commission, we will first take questions and comments from the EMAC associate members, and after the panels have shared their remarks, and then we will turn to the EMAC members for their questions and comments on the prepared remarks and any feedback provided by the associate members. As Lauren said, if you're in the room, turn your tent card on edge and we'll recognize you. If you're participating virtually, let Lauren know and we will figure out the order that people are going to be participating and responding in. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Lauren for our roll call.
Thank you, Dina. So before we begin our panels, I would like to do a roll call for the members and associate members so we have your attendance on record. EMAC members, after I say your name and organization, please indicate it if you are present. Rob Kramer, FIA PTG.
Present.
Paradetta, Ice Futures US. Present. Dimitri Caruso, Nodal Exchange.
Present.
Bill McCoy, Morgan Stanley.
Present.
Shamila Parachi, Life Power. Jackie Roberts, Public Service Commission of West Virginia. Derek Salmon, CME Group.
Present.
Tyson Slocum, Public Citizen.
Good morning, present.
Dina Wiggins, Natural Gas Supply Association.
Present.
Thank you. EMAC Associate Members, after I say your name, please indicate if you are present. Matt Egan, American Gas Association.
Good morning, President.
Bobby Anderson, Committee of Chief Risk Officers. Sneha Bagri, OTC Global Holdings.
Present.
Greg Broussard, Cargill, Inc. Paul Sissio, Industrial Energy Consumers of America.
Good morning, President.
Will Evans, Citadel. Jeffrey Gollum, City Energy Group.
Good morning, President.
Frank Hayden, Calpine Corporation.
Present.
Annette Hugh, S&P Global Commodities.
Present.
Paul Hughes, Southern Company.
Present.
Tom Mapies, Digital Energy Council. John Melby, Expansive.
Present.
Dustin Meyer, American Petroleum Institute.
Good morning, President.
John Murphy, Mizuho Securities USA.
Present.
Chris Payne, EGSF. Matt Picardi, Commercial Energy Working Group. Melinda Prudencio, the Energy Authority. Present. Frank Stagg, Beetle.
Good morning and present.
Sarah Tamalti, BP Energy Company.
Present.
Jeff Walker, ACES. And Karen Wertz, Natural Futures Association. Thank you. Dina?
For our first panel today, we will get updates from the subcommittee chairs. Tim Fitzgerald is the chair of the EMAC Physical Energy Infrastructure Subcommittee. Tim? Is he on? She's like an Ian.
Go ahead, yeah, let's go to.
All right, we'll move to Ian Lang, the chair of the EMAC Role of Metals Markets and Transitional Energy Subcommittee. Maybe we'll come back to Tim in a little while.
And John Mark's gonna sit in.
Oh, John.
I'm the sub for Ian.
Put on his professor hat.
So Ian asked for me to read a statement on his behalf, and then I invite any subcommittee members to share their thoughts as well. Dear EMAC members, my apologies for not being able to update you this morning. The Colorado School of Mines is hosting the Critical Materials Innovation Hub today. Thus, I am soaking up as much information as I can. The role of mineral markets in Energy Transition Subcommittee feels like the earth is moving under their feet. When EMAC last met, the big topic in the metals market was the low price of nickel and how domestic nickel mines would survive. The price has rebounded in the last couple of months, so that situation is not as dire, but it still is an issue to keep note of. At the October meeting, the subcommittee was discussing whether there was a disconnect between low copper prices and expectations of large increases in future demand of copper. Over the last 2 months, copper prices have increased 18%, and many analysts are claiming that the price is coming in line with expected copper supply deficits over the next 5 years. Needless to say, the report that we thought we'd be writing over the last 6 months has changed more than once, given how the markets have evolved. We plan to continue laying out the parameters of mineral markets that are most influential and discussing how to ensure a domestic supply of minerals that are part of the new energy technologies. Our committee has met, and he said thank you. And just from some additional color, we've been meeting each month. Many of the committee members have put pen to paper and have submitted drafts of their portions of our report. Many of the folks are starting to interact with one another, and I think we'll be in good shape to have a report for you all on deadline. Anyone else from the subcommittee want to share an idea?
Just wanted to, thanks for pointing at me.
I knew you were ready.
No, I was just gonna say that as we were discussing, Professor Lang has been extremely helpful in guiding us with this subcommittee, and we're in good shape, and we had some ideas about getting everyone together, making the next meeting a little longer and, everyone presenting topics. So it's more cohesive and more interactive and people have comments on other people's sections as well. I think it's going well overall.
So I think Tim definitely wants to give an update because I got an email from him this morning. I don't know if he's running late, but let's wait a second. And while we're waiting to see if he joins, we can come back and start the second panel and come back to Tim after the second panel. But just kind of an update for everyone is on timeline. I think I've talked to each of the subcommittees separately about this, but tentatively, we're hoping that the reports are done and ready to be circulated in June, so that at some point during the summer, July, August, whenever everyone is available to meet, because it's really important at the meeting that we're going to vote on the reports, that attendance is full. That will be in July or August. So just gonna give everyone's expectations on timing. That's kind of the current lay of the land. And I think
That meeting will be in DC, right?
yes, that meeting's gonna be in DC and I anticipate it's gonna be only to talk about the report. So it'll be a lot, just a lot of opportunity to give feedback, give opinions, because I think that will be the focus as of right now. And let's go to panel 2.
I'm sorry I'm late. We had no water at the hotel this morning.
Oh, no.
So I have lots of perfume on it. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're, I am too. For our second panel today, we are going to continue the discussion of the potential impacts of Basel III proposals on the derivatives market. And we have Alexa Filo from the Americans for Financial Reform. Alexa?
Thank you so much for having me. I am profoundly honored to be here and humbled in many ways. It's a complex topic. I do have some prepared remarks, heavily footnoted should others want the formal version of them, but I also know this will be transcripted. And I look forward to leaving enough time for back and forth and doing my best. And yet I will reserve moments of just, having the right humility to say, I'll, respond in writing and so on. But I really do look forward to that engagement after my remarks. So indeed, thank you for the opportunity to join the Energy and Environment Markets Advisory Committee to talk about the importance of these proposals. This includes the Basel III Endgame and the GSIB surcharge proposal. I work for Americans Financial Reform Education Fund. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit coalition of more than 200 civil rights, consumer, labor, business, investor, faith-based, and civic and community groups. We are dedicated to advocating for policies in a financial sector that serve workers, communities, and the real economy, and provides a foundation for advancing economic and racial justice. So who am I? I have a checkered past, shall we say. Prior to joining AFREF, Americans for Financial Reform, I worked in banking and supervision. This included working in enterprise risk at UBS and in market risk control at Deutsche Bank over 8 years. I worked in banking supervision for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for 10 years, ending in 2010. And I was honored to work with CFTC colleagues both at the Fed occasionally and in my role in market risk at Deutsche Bank, and was really really appreciated the opportunity to get that exposure. The agencies should finalize the proposals with the main components intact. And I'd like to proceed to share with you why we believe that's the case. Incorporating only a select set of appropriate tweaks. The additional capital would increase big banks' balance sheet strength and financial system resilience, serving to mitigate against the risks to firms and to the system of a severe financial crisis. The GSIB surcharge proposal would properly incorporate derivatives enhancements, amending the complexity and interconnectedness indicators to include OTC derivatives cleared provided to clients under the agency model. The Basel III Endgame proposal would introduce standardized and non-model approaches to improve the risk sensitivity of CVA to losses in certain derivatives. It would recognize higher derivative exposures and standardized approach to measure that counterparty credit risk in the internal model method and thus warrant higher capital levels. So the crisis, we found crises are bad for everyone. There's plenty to document that. The severity we saw in the 2008 financial crisis make the incremental costs well worth the benefits. No one wants to go through the 2008 crisis again, but we cannot just hope that the biggest banks will be more careful. Wishful thinking will only encourage future financial crises. The large bank capital proposal and the GSIB surcharge proposals address that chronic problem of undercapitalization of the largest banks. The proposal, once implemented, would help to lower the risk and severity of financial crises and the resulting turmoil that puts households and businesses' financial security at risk. The proposals would do this by requiring the largest banks to hold more capital, in particular for their actual risk taking. And right now, the biggest banks capture all the upside gain from outsized risky investments, but the public bears all the downside risk. We pay for the crises through job losses and foreclosures and tax bailouts. The largest banks, particularly the too big to fail banks, would appropriately carry more of the weight and the responsibility for holding big enough capital cushions. Derivatives increased leverage, interconnectedness, and complexity prior to 2008, and the industry continues to pursue outsized leverage in ways that create vulnerability of the ways I described. During the 2008 crisis, some financial institutions were highly leveraged, with those derivatives positions facing steep declines in value, especially those tied to mortgage-backed securities like credit default swaps, but dozens of others, and contributing to the collapse of dozens of financial institutions. Banks would need to maintain capital levels that more accurately reflect that risk that these derivative positions could pose to institutional safety and soundness into the financial system. Derivatives played a central role in the failures or near failures of Lehman Brothers, AIG, and other firms. The most notable failure, of course, among commercial end users in the early 2000s, I'll admit my age here, was Enron, who saddled the firm that saddled JP and Citigroup with billions in credit losses and legal liabilities. Subsequently, you had Amaranth Advisors, excessive speculation in natural gas in 2006, distorting prices, increased volatility, and increasing costs and risks for natural gas consumers, who ultimately pass on inflated costs to their customers. Official sector studies during the 2000-2009 period documented the ways in which speculative futures trades contributed to those spiking energy prices we saw and global food instability. Since then, clearing brokers have had few incentives, it appears, to rein in the dramatic growth in the financial end users' participation in commodity futures markets. And the proposed capital rules would increase large banks' loss absorbing capacity, noteworthy, and hold the largest banks, including those serving these clearing roles, accountable for this risk taking. The largest banks and the financial end users' outsized derivative positions continued to compromise clearing member safety and soundness and financial stability after Dodd-Frank, including for commodities. After Dodd-Frank, several firms continued to build these outsized, whether it was cross-border swap and other derivative concentrations that undermined their safety and soundness and introduced key risk, whether it was JP Morgan's outsized London Whales, Archegos Capital Management in 2021, delivering the first nail, if you ask me, in Credit Suisse's coffin. And these were among the more severe derivatives-fueled events that prompted market turbulence, substantial losses, and official sector inquiries in their aftermath. Archegos prompted Credit Suisse, as we know, to lose billions of dollars and precipitate that slow descent to its forced merger with UBS. And those are the kinds of events that consolidate the industry. Large-scale failures like that of Lehman Brothers had substantial consequences for derivative trading desks in the end-user community. Lehman's uncleared derivatives counterparties filed claims totaling $51 billion in relation to their derivatives, and it was 4 years before the first payments were made to those uncleared derivatives creditors. By avoiding scenarios like Lehman and the London Whale, we avoid being stuck in this perpetual state of financial market fragility, honestly, as long as my career. Whatever that small incremental increase is, it's worth it. The benefit is fewer and less severe Lehman Brothers, London Whale, Archegos, wherever they come from, where derivatives have been a mechanism for leverage. Derivatives concentrations remain a threat to financial stability in particular, while end user financial hedging is often characterized as low risk, and in vast preponderance, I'm sure it is. And yet it is not risk-free for central counterparties and for the large banking organizations that serve in those clearing member roles. Default estimates have again been on the rise for a variety of CCPs, including those with significant exposure to commodity markets. On this, I quote the Financial Stability Oversight Council's 2023 annual report. The recent rise in risk perceptions may be, at least in part, due to the serious stresses that occurred in the LME in March 2022. Irrespective, better capitalized derivative exposures would help to prevent the buildup of excessive concentrations and strengthen stakeholders' confidence in the vulnerable central counterparties and their clearing members in these stressed environments. GSIB proposal appropriately addresses derivatives to cross-jurisdictional activity. It appropriately adds them. The absence of derivatives in the current GSIB surcharge framework results in a significant understatement of the systemic risk in cross-jurisdictional activity. The proposal would revise that cross-jurisdictional indicator in the surcharge framework and include cross-border exposures in derivatives not captured currently, thus making the measure more sensitive to actual risks. Including those derivatives would have the greatest impact on large organizations that are not GSIBs, since the cross-jurisdictional measure is also used for those tailoring categories of the Federal Reserve. And with the inclusion of that derivative exposure would advance certain of those firms to the next tailoring category appropriately to be subject to more stringent capital and liquidity requirements. Basel III Endgame, market risk, operational risk, and CVA reforms would also appropriately require capital for these risks. The proposed rule addresses distinct financial losses that have different root causes. The rule appropriately confronts these separate risks individually, and far from including redundant requirements, although of course there's plenty of interplay, this layered approach provides the needed safeguards for each discrete category of risk. Market risk, capital cushions, the risk of loss from changes in that mark-to-market price of traded positions that we all know well. And here the proposal increases consistency and risk sensitivity and incorporates a tail risk in the measurement of market risk. In op risk, this includes how well financial and non-financial risks are controlled and external factors in the capital markets businesses. It can result in direct losses, but it can also magnify losses. And there are some war stories about this, magnifying losses associated with market, traded credit, and liquidity risks that would have been vastly smaller if the controls to stop the spigot or whatever was not being well controlled. Credit valuation adjustment, I humbly say, refers to adjustments to the transaction valuation to reflect that counterparty's credit quality. Now, I recognize, this may or may not be an area that is subject to further review, but let me just say, in light of the number of financial firms struggling or failing in 2008, market participants started incorporating CVA risk when calculating the value of OTC derivative instruments. A large portion of the CCR losses were because of CVA losses rather than actual counterparty defaults. The proposed rule would require banks to replace the current bespoke model. Bespoke, and I had a great example of bespoke where you just have different firms coming up with wildly different values and not necessarily always being able to recognize those. So the standardized model would improve that sensitivity of CVA risk to losses on certain derivatives. Again, I say this with great humility, and I recognize that this may or may not be an area of review. And yet, while there is some interplay between these risks, I assure you that it's important to have distinct capital requirements to address distinct risks and appreciate the interplay. Regulations play a minor role in the consolidation of derivatives clearing. The largest banks are claiming that they would need to pass costs of additional capital requirements along to derivative end users. They are raising concerns about further consolidation among clearing members. However, a broad set of economic trends have contributed to the shrinking number of futures commission merchants that provide derivatives clearing services. This has occurred over 20 plus years, starting in '02. And this is also part of, frankly, a dangerous consolidation trend in financial services more broadly and the economy over the past 40 years. The insolvencies and bankruptcies of a number of FCMs over the period, over 5 years or so from 2005 or 7 years, 2005, 2012, contributed to the FCM consolidation. The right response to these trends is to restore a more competitive clearing market, conversation for another day, not to block measures that would increase safety and soundness across the system and prevent more FCM insolvencies. Wrapping up soon. The large banks' dual roles in swap dealer land on the one hand and clearing members of central counterparties on the other for exchange traded derivatives make them even more systemically important after Dodd-Frank. Their dual role introduced some notable conflicts, which have been addressed as a result of Congress or congressionally mandated studies that make appropriate capitalization of their own derivatives even more important. The clearing cost estimates suggest even the highest estimates would be modest. The rule will probably make derivatives clearing transactions slightly more expensive. The industry estimates that the impact on derivatives clearing could reach 7 billion, which, and I have not tallied estimates of my own. And yet what I have just tried to take a look at is, while that sounds like a huge cost, what does that look like compared to the 2.2 trillion that the banking organizations are engaged in based, on the OTC reports from the OCC? Or put another way, the 7 billion, how much would that amount to if you spread it across the $24.4 trillion of CMA contracts over 2023? So I'm not going to swear on my math, but if it's 3 cents on the dollar, 3 cents on the penny rather, I wouldn't be surprised. And that's in the comparison or in contrast to futures and clearing fees in the vicinity of $1.50 to $2.25. Now, this is not my area, so I'm speaking out of school, but if others can speak to this and provide a different view of these costs spread, across a very, very large market, I would love to learn more about that. Where there are incremental costs, they must be balanced against the benefits of having more resilient counterparties and a reduced likelihood of another London whale, Lehman Brothers, or Archegos. The industry, I believe, forgive me, that there's some crying wolf here over the capital rules. As a part of a well-funded campaign to stop or dilute the rule, the banks are telling a very different set of stories, in some cases quite misleading, about its impact. Federal Reserve Board Vice Chair of Supervision Michael Barr has noted several times, both written and verbal, that the largest banks either already have enough capital to meet the new requirements or would not need to raise additional equity to meet them. Thank you for the opportunity to share these views, AFREF's perspective, Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund, and indeed, in some of the cases, my own. And I welcome any questions. And I am deeply humbled by the complexity of this topic. And so I recognize that there's some complexity here that I would, where I can, I will respond and dialogue on, and where I can't, I will follow up.
Thank you, Alexa. At this time, I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments from the associate members.
Frank Hayden with Calpine. I'm fascinated by your study, and thank you. It was a very informative presentation. While you're talking, a couple ideas crossed my mind. One was the relationship or the interplay between fees or cost of clearing and liquidity. It seems like a lot of the issues that relate to systemic risk come out of a sudden lack of liquidity in the market to transact, which causes these massive moves and massive calls for collateral. So I'm kind of curious if there was any study done with regards to the relationship between fees and market liquidity of instruments. And then the other thing I thought that was kind of interesting is the CVA approach, where it seems like one of the big lessons coming out of the Lehman crisis was that one size doesn't fit all. It seemed like one of the big takeaways was that, there was a need to address, credit valuation adjustments within a organization tailored to its own risk tolerance, risk structure, and risk measurements. And I was kind of surprised that the thought would be is that we do need a more of a one size fits all approach to manage this globally systemic risk. And so I'm kind of curious if you have any points of view with respect to those issues.
I do have high level views, and we can come back and provide more elaborate in writing. I can't necessarily speak to the relationship between the fees and liquidity, but what I will say about liquidity versus capital, I mean, liquidity is so fundamental. I would never want to argue anything but yes, yes, yes. Liquidity is so many ways number one, but you don't get crises of confidence when you're well capitalized. There's just a different dynamic that goes on, whether you're, and when I say well capitalized, I mean really well capitalized, according to appropriate standards. So I think you need robust capital cushions for loss, and you need that robust liquidity, regrettably, to avoid another Lehman. Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns had notably, particularly Bear Stearns, notably little liquidity. But I value the question around fees, and I look forward to exploring that in more detail. On the CVA approach and the one size fits all, I totally understand why that might come up as a question. And I actually think it's sort of misleading in some ways to stay a standardized approach, because in some ways the standardized approach it is more sensitive to risk because it incorporates things that weren't incorporated in the past in the CCR. And whether it's oil and gas versus or gas versus oil spreads, or the degree of diversification you get in a portfolio. In normal times, those can be very agreed upon. Everybody has a common view of what happens between different spreads and how much, diversification in portfolios you get. But one thing I think was notably absent in the presentations you've heretofore had is what happens in stress environments. I don't love the fact that we have to spend a lot of time talking about things that very rarely happen, and yet we do. So I would love to come back to that one as well.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. John?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Much appreciated. I'm John Murphy with Mizuho. So a couple of different things. One is that I wanted to make sure you were aware that the capital costs do vary per product set. So there is a different capital cost for fixed income products, equity products, and commodity products being the highest sector of product. And it leaves us in a situation where I think when we do see an increase in capital costs for different financial institutions or FCMs, that the costs become so clearly high that some of the end users choose to not hedge some of their physical portfolio or large portions of their physical portfolio. So I'm wondering if you've taken that into consideration, the risks of that into consideration, and what that might do not only to the marketplace from a risk perspective, but what it will do to the marketplace from a liquidity perspective.
Yeah, that's thank you for that. I did notice in doing my research and sort of comparing on the back of the envelope that the commodities per contract fees are substantially higher. And that's regrettable. And I would love to learn more about that structurally. I guess my individual view is when I tried to assess the incremental change to those costs, it was going to be a drop in the bucket no matter how I did the math. So in other words, that is something that should be, one would want deeply to be addressed for risk, and risk because you could hedge more, and for liquidity. Regrettably, I don't think the capital impact would be enough to decisively change that. Again, when I divide it by all the CME tracks during the 7 billion by all the CME contracts during a year, which is much less than, spread across the broader derivatives market, you still get just very small impacts per contract. But I understand what you're saying. You're saying proportionally a lot more of it may fall on the commodities. And I think that's where my knowledge ends. And I just say that it's a healthy dialogue. And I'm sure that the agencies are considering those sorts of things.
Because I think that it is a dialogue, and I think it's a dialogue that we probably need to be a little more expansive on, because if you do look back to the activities of 2022 around the gas markets, particularly the gas markets in Europe, and you take the Dutch TTF product as an example, the Dutch TTF was being margined at a 90% notional at one point, and that kept, I think, market hedgers out of the market, and it kept market users out of the market. So I think what we want to do is make sure that the markets are healthy and the environment is healthy, but that we want to make sure that there is the appropriate liquidity, and that we don't leave people on the sidelines when they should clearly be hedging their physical products.
Understood. And that I see where, you would have those questions. In my view, it's so profoundly important across all products, notwithstanding any one-off individual product, to have a stable financial system. And when I look back at the history of not just financial services, but of the FCMs, I'm seeing that there are plenty of good objectives there for help with prices and liquidity. I'm just not sure capital and solvency are where you would want to give, because the more disruptions or the more insolvencies and bankruptcies you have of an FCM, the more you have consolidation you have. So these are important questions, and I'm certainly not qualified to answer them. Our view is the capital proposal is so important, and notwithstanding those selected tweaks that will need to occur, and that the preponderance of that proposal is really essential to protect the public and our businesses from these risks. And we anticipate that should be able to happen without more than very small impacts on clearing. And yet I appreciate what you're saying, where there could be further study on that big per contract fee that commodities already charges. My next step would be to look at the clearing costs and structure of, for the clearers. And I think those are nuanced relationships.
Thank you.
John Melby, did you have a comment?
I think John Murphy probably covered it better, but the one thing I would just add is also having been around during the energy crisis in the early 2000s, from my point of view, one of the main lessons there was that the market wasn't hedged properly, and that the mechanisms to do that were not available to the marketplace. So anything that takes away that ability to hedge is something that we should be concerned about. That we're going into the transparency that's provided on the exchanges and the hedging capabilities is an important tool to that. But I think John Murphy covered the rest of it quite well. Thank you for your presentation, by the way.
Oh, my pleasure. And one thing that seems clear to me, as I have looked back at the literature in advance of this panel, is that there is a lot of focus, like in a positive sense, of different participants in the marketplace taking a look at the causalities and and what's next. So I appreciate the importance of that question.
Are there any
Rob.
others? I'm sorry.
Oh, I saw Rob Creamer.
Well, no, I need to wait till we get through to the associate members first, so.
Oh, sorry.
Let me see if there are any other associate members who have a comment or question. No, not. Thank you very much for the associate members. And now we'll turn to the EMAC members, and Rob, go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. I really, I have enormous concern just about the FCM landscape and clearing commodities. I mean, one, it's been shrinking over the years, and I hear more and more there's only a handful of players in the space that really can clear the type of business that we do. And the burden on their balance sheet, just because of the way that SACR's calculated as compared to the way that it's handling fixed income products, is very punitive. So the return on equity calculations for an FCM clearing principal trading business and people that are liquidity providers and market makers really makes it unattractive for liquidity providers to engage in commodity markets. And that spirals pretty radically if you start getting into periods of increased volatility where margins are going up. Now, everyone wants to avoid catastrophic risk events. We're not saying that, looking at the events of the financial crisis where people were inventory massive piles of risk, we're looking at scenarios in the energy complex where you have economic equivalent contracts, very important contracts that are hedged with futures that really get no offset. The FCMs are having to capture and inventory these on their balance sheet for their customers, knowing they see no risk in the book. I have these conversations all the time with our FCMs that say, yeah, we see you have absolutely no risk in your book outside of a clearinghouse failure, but there's no risk in what you're trading, yet you're using, in some cases, for some participants, hundreds of millions, if not more, of balance sheet that's just getting tied up. And that's removing balance sheet that should be available for risk-taking activities in terms of putting liquidity in the system for their other customers that are out there. So I think there's an inefficiency. I'd love someone really to look at and for it to be on the front burner. But that would be my point on it.
I value, those points, and I would just sort of reinforce that I don't believe that the impacts would reach the level of changing what is already, I understand, a situation that's being monitored closely. So I think it's sort of, a matter of scale. I do see, where, these points are worthy of a future debate. I'm not sure the CA, the counterparty credit risk, has fully incorporated all of the risks associated with derivative products in the past. And it's because of that issue and because of the range of results that the changes were being made. And yet I look forward to looking at that issue more closely.
Dimitri?
Thanks, Dina. And thank you, Alexa, for your presentation. So just a little background. My name is Dimitri Cruz. I'm with Nodal Exchange. And our focus in the markets as an exchange is in the energy and environmental space. So that's where this perspective comes from. And I too remember Enron. I was in the energy space back then at a competitor when Enron ended up going bankrupt. And of course, remember not so fondly one of the core issues of Enron, which was their ability to mark their own books, which was a key factor in the fraud that they participated in. One of the challenges that emerged from the financial crisis, and I do want to make sure we take the right lessons away from the financial crisis, was in fact that uncleared markets perpetuate that. In uncleared markets, the counterparties didn't often agree on the value of the deals they had on their books, right? That's a function that exchanges provide by pricing every single derivative once or twice a day. So that was a key issue. And then the other, of course, was the daisy chain risk that exists in uncleared markets that does not exist in cleared markets. So the 51 billion of uncleared derivatives liability that resulted from Lehman Brothers that you quoted, the losses, the shared losses that occurred in the derivatives industry, the clear derivatives industry, was zero. That's not a de minimis statement. That's a major, major statement. That's why the G20 said, look, everything possible should move into the cleared marketplace. I will also note that we are all fondly remember, or not so fondly remember, the financial crisis, but we've had several crises since then. And what we haven't talked about are derivative failures, right? Because the system worked. So whether it's the pandemic or whether, and certainly there were challenges and strains in the system, but the systems worked. No clearinghouses went down. If we look at even the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact on energy prices, both in Europe, but also back in the States, there were strains, but no failures, right? These are major events that the industry handled quite handily. So it is not, I think what often, if you're outside the space, what conclusion you often jump to as well, we took a set of risks that existed in the uncleared markets, and now we've concentrated them on these clearinghouses. That's a misunderstanding of the clearing model. It's a structural difference in how risk is managed that reduces risk systemically by bringing them together in the cleared model. It does not amplify risk. And so then I just want to note that, there is a clearing mandate, but it doesn't apply to all industries. And importantly, it doesn't apply to energy. So when we consider the possible reduction of clearing representation or FCM participation, and or the decision because of costs that have been passed on to participants, that participants will take their business off exchange. What have we accomplished in that world? We've just reintroduced the same bilateral daisy chain risk that the clearing model solves. So the one other observation I'll note is that for a clearinghouse, our credit risk is the FCMs. It is the clearing members. So I think it's telling that the clearinghouses and FCMs have joined arms here in opposing these additional capital increases. It's not that capital hasn't been increased since the financial crisis. Bank FCMs do have higher capital requirements than they did before the financial crisis. As a former chief risk officer, I can tell you the question is always how much, right? You can always hold more margin, but how much is appropriate? That's the question, right? It's not that there were no changes required. We did see changes, and now we're seeing more requested. And the collective wisdom of the participants in the industry, both in the FCM space, but also their risk counterparties, is that this is a step too far. And then the final bit I'll just note is the more I participate in these policy settings, thankfully via the CFTC, the more I find that the deeper challenges our industry faces tends to be cross regulator challenges that are more difficult to solve. In this instance, I'd like to echo Rob Kramer's point about SACR and House, which isn't under the CFTC's supervision, but nevertheless has a major impact on how energy, for example, is valued at the FCM level and does contribute to reticence. And I can tell you as a clearinghouse, reticence on the part of FCMs to continue to expand supporting energy clearing. So it's something that I'd love the commission to take up on, but of course, it's not something you can solve on your own. But I just wanted to end with that note that I think it is telling that the clearinghouses and the FCMs have broadly aligned on the same side of this issue, which should note that perhaps this might be a step too far.
Might I just add that, in addition to the question of whether derivatives portfolios themselves failed and whether there was a need for an auction and that like literal failure, you had ample evidence after the crisis that that there was a shortfall for some, to deal with the situations that were arising. With London Whale, we were very fortunate that JP Morgan Chase was a fortress. Frankly, I think it's telling that that they have invested a ton in having a fortress balance sheet. So they're sort of, giving other advice to others. But I think if you have a strong balance sheet, you can handle things that go wrong outside of policy. You have Archegos, you have the 2020 Treasury fiasco and challenges. I recognize a lot of these are due to the financial end users. And that's regrettable that there's been a blurring of the lines between the two sets of users, and an encouragement for those financial users to use these markets for more speculation, which I think has driven a lot of and influenced a lot of the things we've talked about. But it's not to say these aren't really important and valid, in some cases valid, although I will say, and this is, based on a lot of experience, that if your clearing member is critical for the CCP and the end users, I would want the people I'm interfacing with to be well capitalized. And we have a chronic problem of the largest banks, because of their capital markets presence and the riskiest activities. They're currently not pillars of being well capitalized. So you don't have that reliability in your market currently. But I recognize these are the kind of things that we could go on forever, and I would love to offline, but I also respect that folks here are closer to the actual products and environment than I am.
Jamila, and then I think Rob Kramer has his hand up again, so Rob will come to you after Jamila.
Thank you for your presentation, and I apologize, I'm going to ask a question that you may have answered before I walked in. But the question is, during your presentation, I heard what sounded like both OTC and cleared swaps discussion. Is your analysis covering all of derivatives? And when do you distinguish between what you think is necessary for OTC derivatives versus cleared swaps? I just want to nail that down before I then ask another question, but I will get that question wrong if I don't fundamentally make sure I understand the landscape you think is important.
I haven't had the time, frankly, that I would have loved to drill down into more detail on those questions. But what we have done is we've taken the estimated costs and divided them, by the, the number of contracts, including all derivatives, not, when we've tried to assess this, is this an incremental minor cost or is this a huge cost that we have looked, to get at that question. And that, can you repeat the other half of your question?
That was the entire question. You answered it perfectly. And I'm sorry, I didn't even introduce myself. I'm Jamila Parachi, and I represent an organization called Life Powered, which focuses on energy education for the public and consumers. And I specialize there in the interplay between derivatives regulation and consumer energy needs. So I have a long history in financial derivatives, but I am focusing my time on what the impact of derivatives regulation is on my neighbors' bills, my bills. It's very selfish, honestly. This work that I'm doing, I just don't, I really want to mind. This is my new public service. I want to keep in mind, and I think you have a public service attitude as well. What does all of this do to us as people, human beings living, trying to carry out our lives? What really helps us? And I understand that's the perspective you have as well, which is why you think there should be more capital. What I'd like to propose to you is that you do make a distinction between OTC derivatives and cleared swaps. And this is speaking as a person who is a huge, passionate advocate, religious zealot about OTC derivatives. I think that what we have tackled in OTC derivatives is slightly askew of what would be super helpful. There's definitely a Venn diagram where there's a lot of things we did under Dodd-Frank that are very helpful to that market, but I would make a huge distinction between what helps ailments in OTC derivatives versus what helps ailments in cleared swaps. And this is where Dimitri's going to be so thrilled. Cleared swaps prior to the financial crisis did not demonstrate the kinds of things that led to buildup of risk in the financial crisis. And proven by that was Dodd-Frank's effort to bring anything that was not cleared yet in OTC derivatives into clearing, because it's a way to standardize and subject that activity to centralized capital margin standards, and it manages counterparty credit risk very handily inside of the clearinghouse. So when you talk about the London Whale, that is an OTC derivatives issue that also predated the implementation of Dodd-Frank. So I would argue that in fact, I was literally crafting the OTC derivatives program at the time that the London Whale incident was being evaluated. And one of the things we kept in mind was what in our implementation of Dodd-Frank could have prevented a London Whale situation. So I'm very, very close to that as being an OTC products issue. And so I would just caution that when looking at what helps manage risk in cleared swaps is really very different than what helps manage risk in OTC derivatives. Just to step back as well, the arc of derivatives started with people trying to get grain and stuff to each other, timing mismatches, which meant people were growing stuff, it died and it wasn't ready for somebody to buy, but somebody was ready to buy and they couldn't predict if their grain supply was going to work. And so people started doing forward contracts. Over time, that expanded into futures contracts, which supported the liquidity of that underlying market. So I would say that while some of the conversation around these new capital requirements is focused, I think, wrongly on, oh, it's going to cost X institution more money, and oh, we're going to pass this cost on to our customers, that always ends up being a very tricky conversation, because then we're talking about how much money somebody should be allowed to make versus how much money they should be allowed to charge. And fundamentally, probably only Congress, can decide how we want free markets to operate, not a market regulator. Market regulator needs to protect the robustness and the integrity of the market. So what I want to know is, have you thought about in your current study or in what you plan to do, what the policy dimensions are of how to make capital better, not just how to make capital more? Because I do hear the more capital means better protection, but I wonder if there's a distinction between more capital for swaps, OTC derivatives, versus more capital in cleared swaps, and does more capital actually solve each of these problems? And if it doesn't, what are the ramifications, again, to the consumer of shrinking hedging and bringing us back to the realm where people can't manage timing, production risk, and literally getting my lights on. So again, selfishly, I would like to have lights and I would like to eat bread. And I don't want to go back to the days before we had forward contracts and futures available for that risk. And I say all that as a huge OTC derivatives person. I'm just worried that this focus is on your concerns are with regard to the OTC derivatives market, not the cleared swaps market. There's no evidence for failures or risk buildup in the cleared swaps market other than Federal Reserve concerns about concentration.
I really value your knowledge and your passion, and I think you would be pleased to know, to a certain extent at least, that there is different treatment in the proposal for those different types. The entirely uncleared, the uncleared by the FCMs, and then the exchange traded. I will say, I just having experienced a firm like Credit Suisse fail, like the idea that we're focused on concentrations, like you bet, and what we found as well is that the reported concentrations aren't always the full extent of the actual concentrations. So take Archegos. Archegos actually wasn't that big on paper. But it exposed a number of banking organizations, FCMs, 100%. And, in terms of that FCMs being a part of those broader orgs. And yet the exposure was multiple times. I recognize fraud is a part of some of this that we've talked about, that it's not just risk, but fraud continues. Fraud is op risk. So what we've seen really significant impacts. And you could argue that, say, Credit Suisse that was involved in these markets, well, they were well capitalized. They weren't well capitalized by appropriate standards in our view. and that this proposal does get more nuanced and more specific and more accurate about if something doesn't have a liquidity risk, great. If it doesn't have a history of bad correlations under stress, great. Give it diversification. Let them use those spreads and not be so egregiously penalized. The challenge is that history doesn't always bear that out, that there has been risk. But I humbly recognize a lot of the points as well. And as I mentioned, whether it's CVA or other areas that may, that certainly the official sector is interested in the FCM community for further study. And that's quite evident to me. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for joining us and sharing your background.
Rob, and then we'll hear from Derek.
Yeah, I want to emphasize again, first of all, we're saying and believing the same thing. I think banks and other market participants should be maintaining ample balance sheet to cover risk. I mean, risk is the language of our business, our industry. It's very, very important. Where I keep coming back to is situations where, we can talk about, the big events that have happened where people were really speculating in derivatives contracts, holding outright long or short exposure in radical amounts of size that was reckless. And we have market makers and market participants that hedge their portfolios, that provide liquidity in critical contracts, offsetting with economically equivalent instruments. So taking the scenario where you would say, hey, look, somebody was a really bad actor and they had a $100 million long position in some natural gas contract, is very different than a market maker that has a $100 million long position and a $100 million short position, and their FCM is supporting that position as if they have an incredible amount of risk on. And I think that we keep coming back to, if you really want to look at the nuance of how FCMs need to support their customers and how this all gets brought into the clearinghouse, and everyone from the clearinghouse to the FCM can recognize there is no risk. And the language we all speak in our industry, whether you have offsetting positions, it comes back to me that it's a very risky proposition to avoid recognizing the fact that these firms have no risk in their portfolio. And where that risk comes from is, once you get volatility and you're treating market makers and participants that are providing liquidity as if they're holding these outright positions in these contracts, eventually during times of stress, their FCMs, because of the tax on their balance sheet, shut them down. And so as things get out of whack, they're going to get worse and cascade because you're not recognizing this problem. So I just keep coming back to, everyone feels like balance sheets should be sufficient to support risk, but we've got to get this right, and we've got to do it right for commodities. We made a huge step to get to SACR because it was so punitive for fixed income and options portfolios, but it was very punitive to the commodities. And we knew this going into it. Here we are. And I just think that we just need to be mindful of the impact on liquidity providers.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I will just say that, in times of stress, it's particularly important that our largest banking organizations stand firm and willing to provide those critical services and, those business lines, lending to the moms and pops of the world and showing up for business. And so it's those times of stress that we have to prepare for. And, I really do look forward to, in some context or another, continuing the conversation that you laid out and your colleague a minute ago. And yet I'll stick to our guns in the AFR space and just say that the bulk of this proposal is really critical to prevent dangerous repeats of severe financial crises. And those required tweaks should be kept to a minimum, while we do respect that the agencies are appropriately reviewing certain circumstances. Thank you so much for having me today. Appreciate it.
Derek?
Thanks, Alexa. Derek Sand from CME Group. Would probably echo some of the comments that we heard from John at the outset and Alexia and Rob. I think we think about markets as an ecosystem. We have to be thinking about the concerns that the GSIBs have raised about their ability to continue to service the end user customer. I think Rob has made a really important point, which I don't think gets enough play in terms of the criticality of the role that liquidity providers enable for risk transfer to happen safely from a buyer to a seller, from a long to a short. That's what healthy ecosystems look like. Relative to the comment letter that we put forward on this topic, and probably many in this room, we just have a level of concern, echoing some of my comments here, that under the proposed rules themselves, GSIBs and their clients, whether they're commercial customers that our clearing firms serve, or very much the bulk of the open interest holder in our ag contracts and our metals contracts and our energies contracts, that they would actually be disincentivized from clearing their OTC derivatives at central counterparties. So you end up in an adverse scenario rather than reducing risk. We actually believe that some of these proposed rules, as potentially proposed, could likely introduce more risk by curbing access to those very cleared services that eliminate the risk. And I think that we were talking about before. Dimitri specifically called that out in a very articulate way. So I think the benefits of central clearing providing transparency, netting, third-party monitoring would be lost if more clients are forced out of that model. So our goal is to encourage the industry to think about the implications to the ecosystem of a whole, and very much make sure that what is brought out is consistent with the Group of 20 support for central clearing of OTC derivatives, which I think Dimitri called out earlier. Really important that we think about the impact of the ecosystem and the outcome we're trying to achieve. I worry that anybody that says, higher margin is better, well, sure, we could 100% margin everything, and then nobody is trading in listed derivatives. That's the very outcome we need to. It's an academic argument when taken to its logical conclusion, makes the very point that there's a point at which balance goes out of balance and you risk damaging the very ecosystem that has worked. So that would be our concern. I think we've laid that out in our comment letter, but they consistent with many of the colleagues' concerns here today.
Well, thank you so much for that. I will just round out my comments by saying that, that liquidity role, which is so effective, really does require that fortress type of balance sheet to be able to deliver that in all types of environments. The other thing, there's so many things I would love to speak to, but I'd sort of like to call out a bit of a, whether you call it a myth or just a disbelief, but if you go back to your time in business school, equity was not held on the sidelines. Equity, like if you look at energy companies, I did a little check. They hold a lot more equity capital. You don't leave that on the sidelines. You use it. Sure, you pay a little different if you remember our Modigliani model of debt versus equity, but all that is good sources of funding in your sources and uses environment, whether it's equity or debt. And yes, the cost is different because equity is loss absorbing. But in order to provide that liquidity and be there during those stress times, that's why the capital proposal is so important. But thank you for these good questions on the margin that we've been able to discuss today. Tyson, did I leave anything out?
Absolutely not. Alexa, I cannot thank you enough for joining us today. And Commissioner Mersinger, I really appreciate you providing the opportunity to continue this conversation. So thank you very much, Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it as well.
Well, you had your card up. Did you put it back down? Did you want to make a comment? I don't want to leave you out.
I appreciate it. I was wondering if the proposal as it is what, when you look at the concerns of your constituency, is that what you would have wanted? Or is it just covering enough things that you're championing it? Is there?
Yeah, I will say this is, based on, a lot of experience that in the capital market space, where the activities are riskier and just the ability to raise leverage to the degree they can sort of breeds outsized positions, and that's a challenge that we have to face. I'm sorry, can you repeat the other part of your question?
No, that's, you got the essence of it. And just a suggestion from one sort of public interested group to another, I would say one of the things that I look at a lot is what does regulation do to the people that we are trying to help, the public and consumers? And I do think one thing that your organization could look at is, let's say some of these things are true and we start to find hedging less attractive in the cleared swap space. What does that do for Americans' financial freedom, in fact?
You know, and let me rewind a little bit because I feel like I didn't fully answer your last question. What I find is, by and large, whether it's loans to small businesses, loans to first-time Black and brown homeowners, you know, I might, after I leave this, I might be adding clearing to it. What you find is that when you drill down and you actually look at what they're saying, either the largest banks aren't providing much of those first-time loans to Black and brown home buyers, or they aren't making those tax equity finances that folks are worried about, financings that folks are worried about, them, you know, doing some of it, but in highly extractive ways. So you have certain areas that we don't believe there's a huge impact because the traditional lending is a very, very minor impact. It's even for the largest banks. We've had the Bank Policy Institute go on record of just saying, yeah, if you're a traditional lender and the usual stuff, capital isn't that big of a story here. So the regular moms and pops, I recognize though that your end users, food on the table, lights, that is important. We believe that the impacts of this capital proposal are not large enough to impact people's, you know, food on the table, lights, keeping the lights on. We recognize the challenges in the market, however, that it seems like people are appropriately focused on.
It would be great to follow up with you separately, only because I do think there's a nugget in what you said about sort of the largest financial institutions versus mom and pop. And I think one of the unfortunate impacts of the proposal as it is that it's not just going to hit the largest banks. We often forget that the meat and potatoes of how the country's economic engines work is through mid-sized to small organizations in every single sector. It's your non-bank FCMs are participants, huge participants. They make literally these cleared swaps markets work. The large banks that participate in these markets do so as an accommodation because it makes no money. It's a loss leader. They only do so as an accommodation to the other financial services they offer. So I would posit that looking at what happens, not just to sort of underserved smaller people, but what happens to underserved, sort of the muscle of this whole industry, what happens to them and who are their clients? And I think that, like, I have a small business. My clients are small and mid-size. And small and mid-sized institutions have long served small and mid-sized end users and individuals. You know, it's the individual, the small company that goes to folks who are, that's the group that's lost its space over time. And this potentially damages their ability to access these markets in very important ways that frankly keeps the whole thing still working, even though it doesn't really make a lot of money for anybody. So I would love to talk to you offline about sort of this distinction between the major banks versus.
May I just say very, very quickly? So these are only relevant to the large banks. One of those groups is the size of SVBs, that's 200 billion. So yes, or 200 plus billion, that was considered large. But I just wanted to make sure that was clear. And the other thing is the agencies did tremendous amount to avoid impacts to the rest of the regional and community bank community, even to the point of adding those premiums onto the mortgage risk weights, which created such a ruckus. At any rate, we could go on and on. We've been in conversation with small business, and I really would love to engage with you on that. So
that would be great. I agree. Yes, understood. It applies to these financial institutions, but these large financial institutions are like carrying some weight that others, you know, simply would not be able to carry. So I think it would be good to talk about what the unintended consequences would be. And perhaps there are ways that this could be tweaked that protects clear swaps and also protects our constituencies.
And I'm going to jump in here to try to keep us on track a little bit. I think there's a lot of passion around this issue, and we probably should have allocated some more time. But in order to make sure that we get to everything else we need to get to, I'm going to move us along here. But Commissioner, I wanted to see if you had any comments or questions that you wanted to offer.
I just want to thank Alexis. We really appreciate it. Again, I think it's so important to have diverse, views and, and for everyone to hear views on both sides. And so, we really are grateful that you're so willing to do this and to do it on your own. You're kind of facing a large panel here. You did it solo. So that's fantastic. And, I'm so grateful for your time and your willingness to do this. And yeah, we could probably spend an entire day just talking about this particular issue. And I think, we're all looking at it. So, thank you for being willing to do this. Thank you for being willing to also follow up to where there were
100%. I took a lot of notes.
that you needed to look into a little bit more. So, it's just, I just want you to know that we really appreciate your time and willingness to speak to this group.
100% same. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tyson.
I think
Bye-bye.
we're going to go back and pick up with Tim Fitzgerald, who I understand is now on the line. As I said earlier, he's the chair of the EMAC Fiscal Energy Infrastructure Subcommittee and is going to give us an update on where things stand with that subcommittee. Tim?
Yeah, thank you very much. Since my last report in February, the Physical Energy Infrastructure Subcommittee of EMAC has met once. We currently have 2 more meetings scheduled in April and May. And progress on our report continues. We have 2 chapters drafted on petroleum and natural gas. These have been initially reviewed by our members. We currently have 2 chapters in the process of being written. These are on electricity and finance. Drafting has also started on a introductory chapter that kind of has the overarching themes for the report. And I expect these 5 chapters to be the basis of the report. In our last meeting, the attending members agreed that there's not sufficient time or bandwidth to address additional topics in this report, despite perhaps interest in some adjacent topics. At this stage, I would anticipate completion of the draft by late May. There will then be time for additional comments on all chapters of the report from the members of the subcommittee. And after that review is completed and approval by the subcommittee, I would expect the report to be delivered to the full EMAC. We can coordinate timing to arrange that for a convenient meeting. That is my report.
Thank you, Tim. Are there any questions or comments from the associate members on, we did not take questions from.
Yeah, we'll do it all now.
We'll do it all now.
Any questions on subcommittee work?
Right. Any questions or comments from the EMAC members on the subcommittee work? Commissioner, do you have any questions or comments? All right. Thank you both. Thanks, Tim.
I think let's take a short break before our third panel, short 5 minutes, because we're already over on time. So don't go too far. If you have to go to the bathroom, it's kind of far away, so run now.
For our third panel today, we're going to hear from Richard Swan at S&P Global, who is going to talk to us about the inclusion of WTI Midland into the dated Brent benchmark.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come here in person and talk to you all today. I've never been to Kansas City either. I live in Houston, despite the accent, it's just a short hop for me, but it's great to be here in person. We are, as we said at the introduction, my company, S&P Global Commodity Insights, which a lot of you will know as Platts. It is a bit more than Platts. We are the newest associate member as well of the committee, represented by my colleague Annette here as well. But I'm going to take you into a relatively deep dive, as much as I can do in the time available, into a really significant evolution and a really significant price benchmark, which is Platts dated Brent assessment, specifically how US crude from the west of Texas has now been incorporated into this price, what it means. I'm going to give a little preamble to the company a little bit. Some of you I know are very familiar with us, some of you are not so much, but I'm not going to take too long on the general stuff. I will be getting into the specifics. We are now S&P Global Commodity Insights, and we deliver a huge range of information broadly to commodity and energy markets across all of those commodities you can see on the slide. We're probably best known, I would say, and I've been with the company, I should have told you this, sorry, I've been with the company about 26 years, always on the editorial side, focusing on the teams producing the content. I now manage a good chunk of our teams producing the oil price assessments for refined products, crude oil, all the different oil markets. So that's what I've been involved in. That always used to be called Platts. We still use the Platts name, and we call our assessments Platts price assessments. So that's who we are on the price assessment business. But the range of offering is very large for sort of analytical services as well. Particularly when the discussions get into other things, some of you might be looking at the agricultural markets over the next day or two, some of the energy transition markets. We have a lot to talk about in that space. If you want us to come back and talk about that, that wouldn't be me. It'd be one of my colleagues. I'm the oil guy today. People use our assessments in all sorts of ways, just to be clear. I think that will be obvious just from who's around the table and who's online. We're very aware of this. We ourselves, this is critical to stress, we are totally independent in the markets. We do not have a view on the price. We publish our price assessments. We don't have a vested interest in prices being higher or lower. That is not appropriate for us. We have very strict rules about what we can even get involved in as individuals. I'm not even allowed to hold stock in any companies in any of these sectors or anything like that. Some of you may be coming at this from different angles today, and you're welcome to ask questions sort of specific to where you're coming from. I should say I'm going to be focusing mainly on the physical price assessment that underpins the Brent complex, let's say. There are a range of financial instruments related to that. I will touch on some of that. But if you have questions that want to get deeper into the specific angle you're coming from, please use the time available. I'll do what I can to answer everything. But we are here to talk about dated Brent. What is dated Brent? It's a price assessment published by Platts. Has been since 1987. It's without question in the very top tier of significant commodity price benchmarks in terms of how much exposure there is to it across all continents of the world. There's an awful lot of attention on this price, and it matters to a lot of people. But it is a physical crude price benchmark. In essence, it reflects the spot value in the spot market of a single cargo of crude that a refiner might buy from the North Sea. Historically, that's what it has represented. So you want to buy a one-off cargo of crude. Crude is an interesting market because crude is the biggest commodity market by most ways you measure it, by the dollar value. But crude trades in very, very large clips in the physical market. You can't buy a little bit of crude oil, physical crude. You're going to buy a cargo. Cargoes are big. In this market, they're now 700,000 barrels for one single trade. That means you always need to be mindful when you think about a crude benchmark of liquidity. How much physical liquidity is there? How much supply is available to this market? You don't need to worry so much about demand. They're not quite the same in these markets, right? Demand is, relatively speaking, on a constantly upward trend, roughly plateauing in some markets, but refineries can buy crude oil. How much there is available is important concern to us as the provider of the benchmark, the custodian, if you will, of dated Brent. This chart's interesting because it shows you the volume of physical crude oil that underpins the benchmark over the last 20 years or so. It doesn't go all the way back to 1987. What you can see is that there have been additions over time. This benchmark has evolved. The one I'm going to focus on today is the latest evolution, but every time you see the series jump, essentially more crude, more alternative grades of crude have been added to, if you will, the basket of crudes that represents dated Brent. In other words, since the first one came in there in 2002, dated Brent is not just Brent. The Brent oil field in the North Sea production has been dwindling for a long time. It's the bottom of the darkest column. I hope that renders for those online as well, but it's the bottom. Not much of Brent is Brent, to be honest. That oil field has been declining for a long time, and the alternative fields that have come in have actually been very similar grades. It's, if you like, it's like an alternative delivery mechanism. That if I commit to give you a cargo of Brent crude, I can choose which of those I give you since they've been added formally to the basket. The logic being that that puts more liquidity, more available supply, and it prevents the market becoming too small and too easy for one participant to sort of have too big a share of. It creates the right conditions for a benchmark. So there was a step jump in 2002. That was actually when Forties and Oseberg, excuse me, another UK crude one from Norway came into the benchmark. Then again, 2007, and then, but lately there was actually one in 2018, the Palest Blue. And at that point, there were 5 grades, all of them from either the UK or Norway, all loading in and around the North Sea. And it is a North Sea benchmark. What we're here to talk about today is what you see on the right-hand side of this chart. The very substantial, slightly pale, sort of salmon-colored bars. I should have made that a bit bolder, I'm sorry. This is the addition of WTI Midland crude into Dated Brent in numerical terms. The reason the bar of 2023 is not as significant as the 2024 is because actually it came in the middle of the year. So it's just an annual average. It wasn't that there is suddenly even more WTI Midland available this year than last year. It just came in midway through. Roughly speaking, if you look where we are now, 2024, it's more than double the potential volume. So it just means there's a lot more oil that can underpin this benchmark. So there are now 6 grades that make up Dated Brent. They're all relatively similar. These are light, sweet crudes. And this really matters, right? The physical properties really matter on these crudes. WTI Midland is actually slightly lighter than the other grades, and on the whole will be at or below the sulfur content of the others on the whole. But they're pretty similar. This isn't heavy sour crude. This isn't what sort of Russia would produce or Saudi Arabia. It is a North Sea benchmark. It is used as that reference point because it's represented, despite the big fluctuations in supply available to it, it's represented a consistent quality, give or take, since it was launched in 1987. And over that time, it's come to become more and more important. There's a lot of detail to get into about how Midland came in. So I'll walk you through some of this. But just quickly, I hope you can all get a copy of these slides afterwards as well if you're interested. These are the key steps in the evolution of Dated Brent since it was launched. It wasn't launched when first production came out of the North Sea, but it was in the 1980s. And ever since has remained sort of the premier waterborne crude benchmark, let's say. And in bold, you can see the additions through the phases when the new grades have been added. Like those bold ones would correlate with the jumps on the bar chart we saw on the previous slide. But the inclusion of WTI Midland, which happened with effect from June cargoes last year. So really it was starting to enter the market's mindset about this time last year when it started becoming a reality. But it was the culmination of quite a long process because West Texas is not in the North Sea. Fundamentally, this is why it was such a big deal. I'm actually going to fast forward over this one. Oh no, I'll stop it in a little while. I'm conscious of time. But just to call out really here that it didn't just get added out of nowhere in the middle of last year. That addition with effect from the June 2023 cargoes was actually the culmination of a long process of consultation with the industry. We publish Dated Brent. It's what my company does. And we have to control the methodology of that assessment, but we are very conscious of the need to involve shareholders from all stakeholders, from all sides when we are embarking on a major change. And that was really what we did. So you can see how long ago we started thinking about this. And I would actually say the first step that enabled the addition of WTI into Dated Brent was really that one in 2019, when you had the ability to reflect crude being delivered into Rotterdam in the Dated Brent benchmark. So the benchmark is really at the loading points in the North Sea. It's sort of where it, roughly speaking, where it comes out of the ground, or the first point at which you can load it onto a tank. So the nearest terminal to where it's produced. It's an FOB benchmark in that sense. But by enabling delivered crude into Rotterdam to also be part of the mechanism, you're also broadening the liquidity pool. And that's actually the mechanism that paved the way for the introduction of WTI Midland. You can't have a mechanism where the seller can nominate the crude to you and you just buy a cargo and you don't know which one you're getting, and I'll choose if I give you Brent or Oseberg or Forties. That's fine, they're all in the North Sea. But if I were to tell you, oh yeah, you've got to go to Houston for this one, that's a different, that doesn't work so well. So there had to be a mechanism for the delivered basis to work. This is the first non-North Sea crude coming, just to reiterate that point. It's a long way, it's more than 2 weeks sailing time. So it's a similar quality crude, but it's very unlike the others. So to liaise with everyone who has a voice in this industry, explain what we had in mind, how we envisage this working, listen to the feedback and actually adapt our proposals as well for how this would work has been fundamental. Without getting too lost in the weeds, what we now see is WTI Midland crude oil regularly and openly offered and bid on a delivered basis in Rotterdam. You can divert to other ports in the region, but it's on a Rotterdam basis. So that gives us a value. We can then assess the value of that crude on a delivered basis in Rotterdam. You can transpose that value back to what is really a hypothetical North Sea loading point. There is no North Sea loading point for WTI Midland crude. No, it comes out of West Texas, which is a long way from Houston, let alone the North Sea. So it's like there isn't a North Sea loading point, but there has to be an equivalent one because dated Brent still represents the loading value of crude in the North Sea. And this is how we brought Midland into that basket. So you have to adjust the sort of freight essentially to take that back from a delivered basis back to the FOB basis, as though it had loaded alongside Brent or Roseburg or any of these other grades. As I said, this started with effect from June cargoes. That's been in effect for nearly a year now. You actually trade forward cargoes, so for those forward trading cargoes, it's been in effect for more than a year, but it was with effect from the oil being delivered in this case or loaded in the North Sea grades from June last year. This is how it works a little bit. I'm not going to dive too deep in the weeds, but if you have questions about what is this I'm showing, I'll be happy to tell you. This is just a screenshot from something called the Platts e-window, which is a communication tool built on top of ICE technology in a partnership with us, but very much in an environment controlled by S&P Global Commodity Insights, which we use every day to gather information in these markets, which otherwise can be fairly opaque. In this marketplace, companies who want to buy or sell cargoes of crude, they show us. I want to buy and they show us the price. I want to sell and I've got a cargo. Here are the dates it's on and here's my price. And this happens every day. This is the information we use to form the basis of the assessment. And if you can see a little bit, what you can see on the left-hand side, you've got companies trying to buy, and on the right-hand side, you've got companies trying to sell. This is a snapshot, quite a recent one. I think this is from earlier this month. It's not a particularly busy day. It shows a random day. And what you see is Midland cargoes now coming in. I think you've got three at the top on the left, and no one's offering a cargo. You've got three companies trying to buy Midland. It's actually the same company trying to buy on slightly different dates, which helps a lot. Dated Brent, by the way, represents, when I say it's a spot cargo, it's pretty prompt. It represents the value of those cargoes loading from 10 days forward is the minimum from today up to 1 month forward. So not cargoes for Christmas time right now. We're now here in sort of early to mid-April. So the dated Brent assessment today reflects sort of the back end of April and sort of the first half of May, give or take. But it's 10 days to a month forward. Who's got a cargo? Who wants a cargo in that prompt loading dates? That's pretty prompt for Ruby. And what you'll see is Midland is now regularly bid and offered in this process. And you'll see the companies doing it. We'll publish all of that information. If you're ever interested in where did an assessment come from, we can show you all of the inputs. We'll show you which company did what, who bid at what price, and then did they raise their bid? Did they withdraw? Did they trade? Whatever happens to the evolution of the bids and offers, it's really important that that is open and it's visible to everyone. This screenshot actually looks almost exactly the same as it would to the traders in this physical market. This is a screenshot from one of my team. So the only slight difference is everything comes out in red font at the top because we can't trade. So everything's red to us. But if you were a trader, it would be essentially executable. If you liked that bid, if you thought someone's bidding quite a high price or offering quite a low price, you can hit the bid, lift the offer, and it can lead to a trade. This is how the physical crude market in the North Sea trades every day for the dated cargoes. And they form the basis of the dated Brent assessment. I was slightly wary when I was sort of asked to do this. Not wary, because I love talking about this methodology change, but I'm conscious that the Brent market in its entirety is quite a complex market. This is just for the spot cargoes that form underpin dated Brent. But there are many other things in the North Sea. Excuse me. So I'll stay on this one for now. There are also a whole host of different derivatives markets. There's the ICE Brent futures contract and other futures contracts you've heard of. There are CFDs on a weekly basis that are very actively traded in the paper market as well. Brent also trades in the forward market. There's a thing called cash Brent or cash BFOE, they call it sometimes, Brent 40s, Roseburg forget of this, they haven't quite managed to work out how to put Midland onto that, but it is the forward market. In the forward market, you can trade now here in April, you could trade a July cargo. If you wanted to buy a cargo of July Brent, it's just July. You don't know if you're going to get it on the 2nd of July, or the 12th, or the 23rd, because it hasn't been given dates yet. So you trade flat months, that's the cash market. The fact that it hasn't got dates means it's not dated. That's where the name comes from. On those prompt cargoes, you have specific dates for each cargo. But what's important to think about that, you have this ecosystem of different instruments, and different stakeholders have different elements of control over some of those. So Platts dated Brent, we do control the methodology. That's our assessment. People choose to use it a lot, but we do control that methodology. Brent futures, we don't. That would be ICE. That's obviously a futures contract hosted on the Intercontinental Exchange. The forward market, cash Brent, is actually just an OTC physical market. So in that sense, no one actively controls it, but actually, in effect, it's governed by a standard contract for the general terms and conditions, which actually are shells. The shell contract terms are used to govern the forward trade. Everyone adopts those trades, otherwise it would be very hard to have a marketplace with everyone buying and selling on different terms. The reason I'm giving you all of that detail is this introduction of WTI Midland into Brent more broadly has also happened. Dated Brent was the instigator for this. The proposal that we formed after broad consultation with everyone was the first step in the chain. But actually WTI Midland, on exactly the same basis as its incorporation into dated Brent, is also incorporated into Brent futures on ICE. It's also incorporated into the shell terms that govern the forward market. So everything lines up in the Brent complex. So you have those different components, futures, the cash, which is like a physical forward market, and the spot market, the dated. There are, if you think of those as 3 corners of a triangle, you actually have derivatives linking every side along there as well. So you have the CFDs, you have data to frontline swaps, you have EFPs between the cash and the futures markets as well. So there's quite a big ecosystem, but at a high level, it's clear to say that Midland is now fully incorporated into all of that. Generally, I'll be talking about dated Brent, but it is in all of those legs. I think this is the last one I've got to show you how it's going. So this is showing you pretty much gone back to April last year, because that's before the June dates got into the dated window. So for dated Brent, in April last year, the different blues, the different hues of blue you can see there are the 5 North Sea grades that were already in dated Brent before WTI Midland came along. And what this is showing you is when Platts assesses dated Brent, which one of the 5 grades was really demonstrating value that day? It's not constant. It's an open. They're all openly bid and offered. And essentially our assessment at a simple level reflects the most competitive grade available. So it prevents any one grade getting squeezed high and bringing dated Brent with it. The value of that grade might go high, but if that's the only grade going high, it won't move dated Brent. If other crudes are available at a more competitive price, they will inform the assessment that day. So you can see there's no salmon. There's no salmon, light brown, like whatever we want to call WTI Midland color. In April, there's none of that because it wasn't in dated Brent. Since then, it's had quite a major say. There's WTI Midland is playing a very active part in defining the value of dated Brent every day. It's actually quite complex how that happens because the way we assess dated Brent, I say it's the most competitive of the 6 grades now. That's on every single day in the curve. So today, April 10th, is it 10th? We're assessing sort of from 10 days forward to a month forward. So you've got a strip there that represents dated Brent, a strip in time that is about 3 weeks, 21 days. We actually assess the value on each individual day. And it might be that at the front of the curve, Midland's really competitive, but for whatever reason, it's not at the back, and maybe 40s is more competitive at the back. So it's a hybrid curve every day, dated Brent. But taken in its generality, this is what you can see. And you can see, yeah, Midland is actually really proving quite competitive on quite a number of days, not monopolizing the benchmark in any way, but definitely had an injection of liquidity into it. The most recent month, we have the data available for March. There's actually a very thin line. It doesn't really show, it didn't render on here, but actually every grade to some degree played a part in March. It's quite rare. Usually for whatever reason, one of the grades will have a month where it's more competitive. But we're seeing these, not only have the volumes gone up underneath the benchmark, but there's a very robust process now every day where the different cargoes are being bid and offered. by different companies. And actually the feedback has been almost unusually positive. When we make a major methodology change to a price benchmark that has significant underlying exposure, we do, in simple terms, we don't anticipate universal support. We appreciate a load of feedback we get, and we canvass a lot of opinion. And as you would expect, we expect people to give us their opinion based on the relative advantage or not to them of the proposal under discussion. That's normal. It's a normal part of our feedback gathering process. What's been remarkable about this, even though it's a very complicated addition to a very important benchmark, it's very positive. Even some people who were initially a bit more on the fence when we were gathering the feedback from them 2 years ago, if I look at how this has gone, and I've been in some of these conversations myself since it came in the middle of last year, face-to-face conversations, I've had to bite my tongue a bit, and people saying, we knew this would work, it's great. And it's not, that wasn't necessarily the case, but it's reassuring that it actually hasn't thrown up big hiccups. It's working well. The actual US export side of it has adapted really well, because there had to be some changes at this end for this to work. As I said, it's 2.5 weeks sailing time. Even once you've loaded the oil onto the boat, it's 2.5 weeks to get from Houston to Rotterdam, give or take. So how does this work to get into a prompt market? So sometimes the oil is actually on the water and somebody's offering it. You can bid for these dates, but it has to work essentially. It also required the loading infrastructure on the Gulf Coast to conform to a greater degree of uniformity and transparency than they're used to. The physical oil industry in the US, I've been here decades, I've witnessed the boom in shale and the growth in the exports as restrictions were lifted. And it's incredible. It's been really dynamic. It's been very organic, but it's been very non-uniform. The money has just flowed where the market was, but not in a similar fashion. So you've had one export terminal spring up here, and they handle their exports like this. Another terminal has been built by a different company here, with a new pipeline they're trying to attract to it, and that works differently. And why shouldn't it in a free market? But to fit into the strictures of a benchmark like this, there has been a bit more uniformity now, predictability of when the cargoes are going to load, transparency over the pipeline connections to get to the terminals. Crucially, and one of the last points I want to really make here, we call this WTI Midland for a really important reason. This isn't the addition of WTI into Brent. Those of us who are here in the States are kind of used to this without realizing it. But WTI is quite a complicated concept. What is it? In the international market, they're very clear about this. When the US crude started being exported, they were very clear. We don't want the blended barrels that you can still call WTI. We want real WTI, by which they mean West Texas crude that has not been commingled with other crudes, lighter and heavier. You can create a right cocktail of crude in the US crude market. We want essentially pure Permian crude that has been shipped through distinct pipelines direct to the Gulf Coast, because it's a long way from the Gulf Coast. It's got to get to the coast. These terminals are mostly in Houston and Corpus Christi, but there are some others as well along the coast. And from there, loaded directly onto tankers without being blended with other things. This didn't used to be a problem to the domestic refiners here. They've been used to refining a blended barrel for decades. But the international market is very clear. They wanted pure Permian grade WTI. So we call it WTI Midland, as the industry does. Sometimes if we shorthand that, we'll call it Midland, not WTI. It's important. But that's what I'm talking about, the export infrastructure having to adapt a little to the norms of international trading, disclosing the provenance of the crude, and really because the buyers want some certainty of quality. That's what it's really about. If you're going to put a crude through your refinery, you want to know what it is. Makes sense. So really, this is what's happened over the last year. This is now well established. Every day it's working smoothly. Some days there might be no cargoes that are offered at Midland. Some days there might be a lot. But it's now seems to be working well. It's got a broad acceptance from all the participants. We are very pleased with how this is going. It's my message to you today. Also very pleased that actually it is represented uniformly across the different elements of the Brent complex, of all those different instruments in different markets, that they are the same thing. If there's a disconnect there, it could have been problematic. There is not. So with that, that's the end of the formal presentation. I'd love to see what questions you all have for me. We normally spend about 3 hours going through this, right? So I've done the 20 minutes, what we normally very easily take 3 hours with. And we get all sorts of questions. So I'd love to see what I can help you with.
Thank you, Richard. Do we have any questions or comments from the associate members?
Yeah, Sarah Tomilty, VP. I have actually two questions. I understand, based on liquidity issues, the benchmark kind of factors in not only the spot cargoes, but derivatives and forward market. Is there any other, is that unique to oil markets, or are there other markets like that? Maybe some of these emerging markets that have less liquidity that you would kind of formulate a basket of pricing to kind of prop up a benchmark price.
Thank you. There's sort of two elements to your question, if I've understood it. One is really around the link between do the derivatives inform the physical a little bit, which is happening in Brent. I'll talk about that. And then there's the alternative delivery, if you like, of physical. If I haven't got this, can I give you that? But physical to physical a little bit. Derivatives to inform physical happens a lot, partly because if you think about what I said about how big a crude transaction is, I know, sorry, but for the benefit of everyone, a crude cargo is a huge thing. I might not have a crude cargo to sell you every day, but I need to know the value of it every day. The derivatives market, despite what we heard in the earlier session about liquidity concerns, it is generally a lot more liquid than a physical market. You can have a lot more transactions, there's a lot more visibility as to value. As a result, it's really important. So for data Brent specifically, really actively traded are in conjunction with each other, the partial forward market, which is the cash market. Technically, that's a physical market, but they're trading partial cargoes. And unless you trade enough to convert to a full one, they will remain financially settled. But they trade in conjunction with the CFDs, which are weekly derivatives specific to data Brent. You don't get many weekly swaps contracts, essentially. You'll see you do. They help us define the value, the forward value of data Brent in the paper market week by week, so very granular. We use those in conjunction with the physical cargo bids and offers I showed you on the earlier screen to work out, well, is that even competitive? Is that just a low bid or a high offer? Oh, actually, that bid has tested value. It's actually above where the paper market says it should be. That's a very competitive bid at that point, and no one's selling. And you start to learn whether or not the physical market is actually stronger than the paper or vice versa. That happens every day in Brent. That interplay between derivatives and physical is more mature and actually more complex in Brent than in any other market I've seen in commodities. But at some level, it's quite common. A lot of physical commodities trade on just a floating price basis. I'll sell you this next month and we'll pay that reference plus $1. That's a floating price reference. And at that point, your deal is done. You might have a pro forma invoice, but you're not going to settle that physical transaction until the time you can actually wind forward a month and know the value of the underlying reference. The problem actually is for us, it's price. Okay, so you've done the trade from delivery in 1 month's time at somebody's index plus $1. What's that worth today? What's the value of the underlying today? So in other words, any market that trades on a floating price basis, if you want to produce a price assessment on an outright basis in dollars per barrel, per ton, per ounce, whatever it might be, if you want a real price reference for that today, we need to understand the forward value of the derivatives market to understand the physical today, otherwise we can't do it. So lots of markets trade on that sort of floating price basis. From metals to agricultural commodities, they've always done that way. Sometimes they coexist. You can have people trading on a flat price basis, outright, I'll just pay you $2 a gallon now. And someone else might say, all right, but I might do a futures contract plus 2 cents. Which of those is worth more? You have to be able to understand that. So we're well used to looking at those mechanisms, I would say, across. The alternative delivery mechanism. So some markets don't need this. If you think of a market like ethanol, diesel, or any of these markets, there's a fungibility in the specification that means the diesel you produce at this refinery is essentially the same as his or hers. It's all the same. And at that point, they are interchangeable. You don't need to have a full mechanism for that. Crude oil is quite unique in that almost everywhere in the world, when you buy crude oil, it has a sticker on it telling you which underground deposit it came from. They're not all the same. They all have slightly different properties. They'll give you a different yield in your refinery. They're all slightly different metals content, things like that. Because of that, there are a couple of instances in crude where alternative delivery mechanism happens. It is complicated, so it's only really going to happen when the market needs a benchmark with liquidity underneath it for that to happen. So the other obvious example is Dubai crude in the Middle East, which is used as the main price reference for the biggest price reference in Asia, let's say. along with Oman, Dubai and Oman. There's this, it's not quite the same as Dated Brent, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole here, but there is an alternative delivery mechanism in those markets. But in markets where you have a fungible spec, you don't need it.
And my second question is, obviously politics in the US is moving constantly. Politics are moving. Are there any risks that you're concerned with over politics?
Okay, I'll be careful what I say, 'cause I'm definitely not going to make a comment on the elections. It's not appropriate for me. Not just for our company, but I'm even a Brit living in America. It's definitely not. But I would say this way, yes, WTI Midland has been added to the North Sea data Brent reference. Obviously, that's dependent on exports. If there were no flow of exports for any reason, they wouldn't flow. But it's not that data Brent represents WTI Midland. If there's no Midland, there's still 5 other grades in that box. Same as they were in March last year.
Sneha about Rio TC Global Holdings. Some comments, questions. I'd imagine that with the shipping, the freight equation adds a complexity to the pricing for the clients, for the ultimate traders to consider, to also track freight costs and monitor that, and that may have an impact instead of just looking at the North Sea, right? You have the additional shipping costs, and I also imagine that with more cargoes in the basket, ultimately it has led to less extremes in prices in data differentials. And lastly, the question I would ask is, what about the smaller trading companies that may not have US export grade flows or production as maybe some of the larger firms do, especially in Europe? Would that impact their ability to stay in the market on certain days and less liquidity and less market depth as a result?
Okay, that's really great points you're raising there. Thank you. Firstly, the freight component, and then maybe we'll talk about the market participation. Firstly, yes, freight is obviously a really important consideration. So if you're going to offer Midland grade WTI in Rotterdam, you're offering that. Your offer incorporates the cost of your freight to get it there. So from a market perspective, this is trading on a delivered basis. So if I want to buy it from you, it's actually on a SIF basis. So freight is your problem, not mine, at a really simple level. All right. So but you do have to factor it in before you make that offer in the market. But it's not then we do a price and then freight goes up and my final price will go up. No, we've agreed the price. So at that level, it's true that from the buyer side, not too much to think about. From the seller side, for sure. And actually, we've seen more attention. We're fielding more questions about transatlantic freight for this route. Freight varies by tonnage class as well. Right? So this is only for Aframax tankers, 700,000 barrel cargoes. That's the cargo size of the North Sea to fit. And there is more interest in that route. There are derivatives markets in some of these freight routes, and we've seen some uptick in interest there as a result as well. It's definitely true, but it doesn't necessarily factor into the final price from the buy side. If that makes sense, because you're trading on the delivered basis. So as a participation, we haven't really observed too much of that. I would say we see who's bidding, and in particular who's offering the Midland cargoes. To offer the Midland cargoes, you need access to a stream of oil, of course. Anytime we add, though, if you think back to that evolution of data Brent, it used to just be Brent. When we brought Forties and Oseberg in, suddenly the equity holders of Forties and Oseberg could offer more cargoes. They couldn't offer cargoes before because they didn't have Brent. They do have some Oseberg. Same with Ecofisk, same with Troll, and now with Midland, we're seeing that. So yes, there are some companies adding in some liquidity, extra liquidity, but not at the expense of anything. But nothing has changed. If you want to bid or offer the North Sea grades, that's still a vital component of the data Brent basket, of the price assessment process every day. So that hasn't necessarily changed. But yeah, it's a physical market. In that sense, to join the physical cargo market, to offer, but you have to have cargoes available to offer. Doesn't mean you have to own the crew in the boat. But you have to have access to cargoes.
Yeah, I just have one small comment I wanted to add. And Richard's doing a great job walking you guys through this in the express delivery of this. But Sarah mentioned politics. One other thing I want to factor in is something we're looking at right now in terms of WTI Midland exports. is most of you have probably heard about the forecast for hurricanes, and Richard and I have weathered a number of these situations out of the Gulf, not only across crude, but products markets and all of that. So it's something we're looking at, like what if scenarios, but beyond politics, weather is always something we want to, another factor that can impact the markets, and just that I want to comment on this year.
Great presentation. Thank you. Question I had two questions. One is, with the expansion of WTI Midland into the e-window, did you see it like an increase in market participants, or is it the same cast of characters that you previously saw? And then the second question is, with the CIF type delivery, is there particularly nuances there that would that a market participant should be aware of, or is it pretty much default to a CFD resolution, or how does that kind of work?
Yeah, participation wise, generally it's been quite broad. There's been maybe a change in emphasis. Some of the companies who can, have a bigger slice of the pie from the export market on the Gulf Coast, we're seeing some of them offering their cargoes. They're generally players active in the global markets, though. Maybe a different entity, but same parent company, let's say. But there's been interest from some, and we could, if you're interested, it's a longer discussion. It's all published. Every time any company comes into this process, we publish it. So we're happy to share the names of the things we've published with you. But broadly, it's similar participation, just a bit deeper every day. It's more robust, I would say. CIF, as an Incoterm, CIF has its complexities. We tend to shorthand and say CIF is a delivered basis. This is true, but actually title and risk pass at load port in a CIF transaction. It's not the same as DAP, where actually the title and risk will transfer at the point of delivery. So there are some nuances to that. But this isn't new for the buy side in Europe, for the refiners buying. They buy plenty crude on a CIF basis. They were already buying, to be clear, the five other grades, Brent, 40s, and Oseberg, Equus Control. You can buy those on a CIF basis in Rotterdam already. You had been able to before this, and that was already part of Dated Brent as well. So this is just one more coming in. I think the thing to call out is it has to be single cargoes on that tanker. So it's going to be on an Aframax tanker, because there are some serious logistics involved. US has a lot of crude, and they do export sometimes some very large tankers. You can do partial lightering and load of VLCC and take 2 million barrels. That can't go into Dated Brent. There's almost nowhere in Europe you could unload that vessel. So that's not going to fit.
Thank you.
I think that's all from our questions from associate members. Going once, going twice. How about any questions or comments from our EMAC members? None online?
Anybody online?
No.
Okay.
So Richard, Derek Sam from CV, thank you. I think you painted a very clear picture of the importance and the growing importance of US-based physical crude. I think the last numbers I checked were US is producing a record 13-ish million barrels a day, exporting close to 5. The sea change there was lifting the export ban back in 2014, 2015, fundamentally changed the role of US physical crude in the export market. There has been significant changes over the years. I think the most significant was the announcement a couple of years ago, the inclusion of a WT marker into Brent. Frank, to come back to your question, not surprisingly, we're seeing that changes are creating opportunities for Brent futures on ICE to trade. We're seeing a significant increase in global participation and new commercial participation in our WTI contract. And here's why. By the time you introduce a new WTI oriented grade or US physical grade into the basket, we actually have a customer base in Asia that now has a new compelling reason to be directly engaging in WTI trading on Climax, for example. So if you kind of look at what's going on, so I'd probably similar question, I think, to the, if you were to ask me what we're seeing in differential client participation, our commercial participation in Brent this year, or in WTI is up about 24-25% year on year. What's more interesting, I think directly answering your question, is that our non-US, in particular, our European business is up 29% this year. So we're effectively seeing new participants that really didn't have a direct exposure to WTI previously. Now, through the inclusion of the basket, have direct exposure to WTI. They can get it through the basket itself. We're seeing more and increased levels of participation from not just Europe, Asia as well. I think Asia business up maybe 10% on or thereabouts. So it's creating direct exposures that weren't explicitly there before. We're seeing similar situations in natural gas and Henry Hub, for example. More customers as the US is exporting at max capacity with liquefaction being what it is today. We're seeing now European participants creating more Henry Hub because they need to get physical exposure someplace. So it's interesting dynamic parallels in some ways. I think, Richard, you did a great job explaining what the role of and the amounts of time that WTI is kind of the lead impact and the price setter within the Brent basket. That's important as well. It just highlights, I think, the market that the CFTC oversights here in the US, that these markets don't operate in silos. These markets are connected. There's basis. There's a lot of trading between WTI and WTI and Brent on both ICE and NYMEX. I think that's a market that you oversight very, very well. The last thought that I would have is that this is a terrific view from the Brent inclusion and adding WTI. I think it might be interesting for the committee to also see and understand how US assessments are made through Argus as the primary provider of price assessment in the US. So maybe at our next meeting, we have a similar and parallel conversations around kind of what Argus is doing in that space as well around the US crude market. If you got a kind of energy convention, you're probably sitting next to somebody from Argus and having this conversation, talking about the differences, the unique characteristics, the similarities between what's going on and the unique way in which these markets interact. So it's playing out in lots of different places, the derivatives market, cash markets. I think this is a great description of what's changing and how that's impacting not just Brent, but participation levels in WTI as well on NYMEX.
Thank you for drawing attention to that. And yeah, it was obvious to me, sort of, I think back to before the export restrictions were lifted, the US was already a huge crude market, not 13 million barrels a day, but was already one of the world's biggest producers and rising. But, and I don't say this as a criticism, it was very insular. It's huge, but insular. And it's not now, it's interconnected. It started even before Dr. Midland came into Dated Brent. If we looked at the value of crude loading FOB Gulf Coast, wasn't going into Dated Brent, but it was going to Europe. Think about this, if you're going to export, you have to hit the arbitrage. You can't put the oil on a boat, sail across the Atlantic and expect to sell it $1 more than all the local crudes. No one will buy it, right? It's just not how it works, right? So even before it came into the Brent mechanism, the link was starting to become very real. And it was actually already influencing the Gulf Coast price and by extension, the domestic price for the Gulf Coast refiners. Because there's not a lot, it doesn't cost a lot of money to move the oil from the refinery to the dock in Houston or in Corpus. It's pretty easy. So there's never too much daylight between those things either. So the impact was already there, feeling that impact. If you don't mind, I'm just going to pick up on one thing, use one of my trigger words a little bit. We don't, and I'll tell you why, we try not to talk about WTI Midland setting the price of Dated Brent because it is quite complex. It's not as simple as just saying, well, Midland is now Brent. It's one of the basket of 6. And even when it might have on that bar chart I showed you, like it's helping to define the value on a certain day. Actually, if you lift the lid and look at the spreadsheet we're doing, maybe it did on 10 of the days, but 2 of the days it was 40s, and then it's Oseberg. It's very granular. And even when one of them is more competitive, it's not violent. They're very close to each other in value. So it's not that it's come in and sort of transformed the value and it's now just thrown out the North Sea grades, let's say, and it's Brent is Midland. It's not that simple. It's helping add liquidity to it, helping define the price. I'm sorry, that's why it's one of my.
I'm sorry to trigger you. Maybe one last point. I think, Richard, you made a really good point talking about how interconnected so many of these differentials and spreads are. So there's lots, and I think maybe, Sarah, come back to your question, or a question that was raised before. There are so many interconnected differential markets that need liquidity, and a lot of that liquidity will be based off one primary contract with either cash settled diffs or otherwise to either reference a distribution cost or transport cost. So WTI is not a single product. If you look at the basis contracts built out under Argus, that's a contract over the last 5 years that now has probably over 500,000 contracts open interest that trades as a dip between WTI in Midland out to, or from WTI in our contract out to any of the 7 different points. So there's a nexus and an ecosystem underlying the price based on who you are, what your physical needs are, what your price exposure is. And so this ecosystem Richard talked about are imperative for everybody in the ecosystem to have liquid markets to access and slide prices also.
I'm going to jump in here again, try to keep us on a little bit on track here. Thank you for the presentations. And Commissioner, did you have any comments or questions?
No, just enjoyed learning all of this. I wouldn't have a question that would be intelligent enough to provide anything, but we learned a lot during this presentation, so, and the discussion afterwards, so thank you. And thank you to everyone for the great questions and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
And for our fourth panel today, we're going to have a presentation exploring the infrastructure needed to meet future demands on the power markets and the path and cost of obtaining net zero carbon in the US. So we have Matt Led from 1898 and Company.
Ready, keep rolling? Okay. First, I want to thank the CFTC, this advisory committee, for inviting me here to speak with you all. I'm actually an alumni of UMKC. I got my MBA here several years ago. A lot's changed since then, but so a little bit about me and a disclaimer at the same time. Everything I'm talking about here is really sort of my opinions based on my experience working in the power industry. It's not, doesn't represent my company or clients' views and opinions. So you'll hear kind of my thoughts based on my experience. Why that's relevant, my experience is relevant. I've been in the power industry for 20 years. I oversee a consulting area where we advise electric utilities, electric markets, developers of assets that would operate in the electric markets, all things sort of justification of or revenues associated with those assets. So helping utilities roadmap what their future power supply looks like, what is the cost trade-offs of adding new infrastructure to meet those demands. Scary, 20 years is my anniversary this summer there, and doesn't feel like it's been that long, but and I'm going to talk about both power supply and some of the delivery aspects here. And I'll start with a little bit of overview. And I think that when we get into these conversations, and I'm also usually talking to folks directly in the power industry. I know we're all in the space, but sometimes I can get tunnel vision just thinking about that space. And I think maybe this is a common knowledge or a common understanding that there's a lot of discussion out there we hear around going to 100% clean energy, decarbonized energy. I think that's not just a unique to the electric industry discussion at this point, but so where we're at today versus if we took a step back 10 years ago, there was a little bit more hesitation or skepticism around could we actually do something like that? There were sort of modest goals around 20%. Could we add 20% renewable energy, things like wind, to a portfolio? And there was a lot of, and I think engineers just don't love change and some of those things. And it was like, oh, this is going to be too hard. We can't do that. And all of a sudden, here we are, probably 10 years, 15 years later, and there's a lot of enthusiasm around we're going to go to 100%. I believe that. I do think where we're at today, it feels more of an aspirational goal than a real reality. I think we can get there, but we're talking about significant sums of dollars or cost to get there, and time and really sort of the wherewithal of the collective. We've all got to be on the same page there, and so I think that's remains to be seen if that's we can actually do that. But there's pockets of the country that are certainly leading the charge there. The other thing you'll note is 100%. Maybe we just talk about 100%, or that's the term thrown around, but what does that actually mean? There's a lot of different sort of definitions of what that looks like. So you might hear net zero, 100% clean. There's utilities that will talk about real zero, and those might expand beyond scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 type emissions. So now all of a sudden you're going beyond just what your direct control of emissions are to say what is our indirect emissions and those sorts of things. So just really amping up the target of what this means, the scale of what this means. Another thing I'll just point out in general, I think of these targets as the timeline to reach them is generally people talk about it in a 2050 type time horizon, but there are a variety of timelines and even interim targets for where people are sort of setting commitments, goals, ambitions to hit some of these targets. And it's surprising to me that a lot of the latest announcements are really trying to speed up that timeline. Instead of 2050, let's do 2040, let's do 2035. And as somebody who appreciates some of the financial aspects of these discussions, one of the things that always grates on me is I rarely hear a discussion of what is the cost of doing that. So I enjoy, one of the reasons I enjoy what I'm doing is I get to help, explain what does 100% mean in terms of cost, scope, scale of infrastructure. What would 90% of clean energy mean? And sometimes that's a significant difference in cost or even execution implementation. So all that being said, I guess, again, kind of over the last 10 years, we've seen a number of the electric utilities responsible for providing the power to customers, making these sort of 100% type transformational goals by some point in time in the future. This isn't all of the utilities that have made commitments or announcements. The statistic might even be a little bit low. There are a lot. It's suffice it to say, some of the icons you see up on the screen are some of the largest electric utilities by customers served by energy demand in the country. So just, significant. This is not a flash in the pan, sort of fad. There's a lot of momentum and discussion around this. So I don't think this is something we're going to just necessarily walk back from either. So don't take any of my comments around the challenges with this saying, I don't think it's going to happen, or I don't think we're going to keep making strides towards it. But it is, we're maybe not accepting or acknowledging some of the challenges or things that we're going to have to overcome to do it. And not just the electric utilities, but also the customers of utilities. If we think about just large corporations as large customers of the utilities, this is a much larger number. And this is, globally, this is again, you see some of the largest sort of corporations by employee headcount or otherwise, even power supply demand out there. So again, just incredible sort of momentum around this. So we're making these sort of goals and proclamations towards 100%. I also think it's maybe helpful to think about or baseline. What do we mean when you hear terms like renewable? RPS, renewable portfolio standard, might be something you've heard in and around goalposts of we're going to meet 40% renewable portfolio standard by so-and-so date. What does renewable mean? What does clean energy mean? And there is some difference. They're not exactly the same in the industry as you think about or how you might implement or meet that goal. Renewable, generally, I would say, these are things like your wind, solar, those are sort of in this category of renewable energy. Large scale hydro, depending on where you are, people don't necessarily qualify or classify that as renewable. So there, there are some caveats that do apply to what this means. Clean energy, I would say, is those sources that do not have emissions associated with them, carbon dioxide or otherwise. So nuclear is a clean energy technology, depending on the sources of energy that go into a storage device, a battery, et cetera. It could be clean energy coming back out of that. Even capturing the carbon dioxide off of a plant that would otherwise emit carbon dioxide, you could think of that as a clean energy source. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what does this mean? How do we actually achieve this goal? And so I start with the demand profile. So this is on a typical day. This is an aggregation of a large, like a statewide level, typical peak day. This is if we're trying to meet 100% energy supply, we want to fill the area under the curve with clean energy. And so if we think about, start with production resources that are sort of on all the time, nuclear is one of those. Nuclear is generally, you're going to turn it on to what its maximum output is, and you're going to run it all the time. So it's got a steady 24/7, 365 type production profile. Other aspects, and these are just sort of indicative, don't quote me on this. Wind does bounce around, but it's windy kind of potentially all day at different times of the day, seasonally as well. Maybe not as windy in the middle of the day and in the summer versus in the winter, but it's something that's kind of there you raise the floor up if you think about adding wind energy to your supply stack. Energy efficiency, this is on the customer side. We add things like more efficient light bulbs, lighting. Those are things that would reduce bring the demand curve down across the board. supply sources that you might think of that are in the middle of the day are aligned with where that higher demand is. Solar is when it's sunny out, the middle of the day, that's when we're getting production. Demand response, this is again, another sort of customer side option that can be reduce air conditioners. For example, you can reduce turn your air conditioner off in the middle of the day. That helps lower that demand at a specific time of day, not every single hour across the day. So the challenge is if you just start to raise the supply up, we're trying to fill the area under the curve. What happens is we can't just, immediately shape this across that whole stack. How customers use demand is different from hour to hour. And so this is one of the, the great challenges with technologies out there that could provide clean energy to how do we meet that, on an instantaneous basis. We got to have a near balance of supply and demand for the grid to actually work and keep the lights to stay on. So what's going to happen is over time, you're going to be overbuilding. You're going to have imbalance of supply or demand at different periods of the day. So we might see a overproduction of solar energy in the middle of the day. And that overproduction can either be, we just don't generate power, or we can put it into a battery and discharge it later. Same thing with nuclear, wind, et cetera. You can have some other supply sources that will be oversupplying relative to demand in that given period of time. This area that I'm circling, sort of that early evening period of time, is the holy grail of if we can get cheap, efficient technology that can on demand provide power, clean power in this period of time, period of the day. That is where the greatest reliability challenge is for the industry, and where the most cost is to ensure reliability is meeting that. So this is where we're discharging. If we stored some of that excess supply, this is where we would be discharging it. This could also be where we're doing things like if we, instead of charging, taking that oversupply and putting it into a battery, we take that oversupply and now all of a sudden we use demand applications like an electrolyzer to create hydrogen. That's the same thing as raising that demand bar up in those periods where there's oversupply. So those are, then when we have a shortfall, the hydrogen could then be combusted, produce power in that period of time. Again, that 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock in the evening period. One other caveat I'll say to this statement though, is that if us as consumers, if we can change our behaviors and how we consume electricity, that if we can change what that demand curve actually looks like and actually bring it down more in line with supply, that could be another way to do it. I think we've grown too accustomed to on-demand power, cheap, whenever we want it or need it. And as our lives become more digitally connected, et cetera, we're asking people to use less power when all of the things they do day to day you need more of it. And even we're going to turn, dryers and washers, make those electric applications, charge our vehicles. We want to be able to go to the grocery store whenever we want to. Hold off on doing that in the these are all things that I think the human element of it is also going to be very unpredictable. So I'm not counting on us being able to move the needle on that demand side of that in that early evening period. So I think I've touched on several of these elements, but one of the things that I like to point out as we go on this journey, and if you think about this journey as where are we at on a percent towards 100% clean energy, the closer you get to 100%, the more the cost will go up. And it's not simply a linear function, it's a exponential function. And so, why is that? Some of the very reasons that I was talking about, we're going to have to overbuild things like solar to capture that excess production relative to when it's needed so that we can discharge it overnight when the sun isn't shining. And then to do this, so you're going to have to over-invest in infrastructure to supply or produce power. You're going to also have to over-invest in delivery infrastructure to move that around where the demand is relative to where the energy is being produced. Another maybe interesting fact to kind of keep in mind is also where are we at on that journey. Everybody's talking about going to 100%. 2022, 2023 renewable energy. If you remember my column of what entails renewable energy, predominantly wind, solar, hydro may be in there as well. That's 20 to 25% of the annual energy consumption in the US comes from renewable sources. If we throw in nuclear, that gets you another nearly 20%. So we're in the 40%. We're not even halfway there as a country to this journey of 100%, which why it's easy to say, let's go to 100% today, and somebody else gets to figure out, deal with the cost, the price tag of that, et cetera. It's something that as we get closer, those challenges and the cost of it becomes greater and greater. Now, akin to things like, I would say the advent of horizontal drilling with natural gas production, we had natural gas prices that were super high, and all of a sudden it created innovation with horizontal drilling, and we had shale gas, and all of a sudden this technology breakthrough. The same sorts of things can and will happen as we go on this cost curve. And I can't sit here today and tell you what all those are, but I do believe that will happen. So while the cost is still going to be pretty high, in my opinion, there are, I think, technology options out there that will help bend the curve, if you will, of this cost as we progress. Things like offshore wind I think is a good example or a good analogy. Offshore wind is incredibly expensive relative to onshore wind. All of the anchoring and everything you got to do to kind of have this floating electrical production device out there is not cheap. It's much cheaper to just put that on land. But where major load centers are, if you think about cities, metropolitan areas, New York City, it's still more cost effective to build a bunch of offshore wind, and you're right next to where it's being consumed versus building a bunch of wind here in the Midwest and then build a bunch of delivery infrastructure to deliver all of those electrons to New York City. The cost trade-offs there are things where it's an example of going up this curve and all of a sudden saying there are trade-offs where something that seems more costly is actually on net a more cost-effective choice in total. All right, so I'm going to talk about another financial concept in the industry. I don't know how much you all are familiar with the term levelized cost of energy, or LCOE. This is, I will say, as complex as this sort of discussion is, you also can't, decisions aren't being made simply on this. A sort of a common pet peeve of mine is you will hear people argue, proponents of a particular technology or another will quote an LCOE type number and say this is the lowest cost, irrespective to what is the value of that energy when it's being produced. If we have a surplus of solar energy in the middle of the day, but yet it's on $1 per megawatt hour, the cost to build that solar and produce that solar energy, if you have more energy than what you need to have all these other things. You need to bring that into the equation to talk about true all-in costs. So LCOE in and of itself is not a decision-making metric, but it is a helpful thing to kind of wrap your head around why is or isn't maybe a decision around particular infrastructure rational. And so also, this is a little bit dated. You all are familiar with a lot of the inflation in commodities and a lot of things, and that all flows through into all the infrastructure and power supply resources we're talking about here today. So this is public numbers, 2022. There's been, since this time, and those are really probably 2021 to early 2022. So there's been a lot of inflation across the board. Technologies have been affected, some maybe more than others. There's also updates are slowing down, and just in general, public numbers, you get what you pay for in terms of if it's free versus if it's an actual, utility procurement opportunity, a non-public situation. The numbers are going to be real or specific to that geographic location. So these are not perfect in the sense that they're just generalized to a broad sort of regional standpoint. It's not going to be perfect in every single location. You might try to apply these numbers, but it's a good sort of representation, relative balance of supply resources. And I think so, no coincidence that if you look at these, some of the lower end cost technologies are the technologies that you hear, utility companies, developers, et cetera, pursuing. Whether it's clean energy or not, there is economics involved in a lot of that as well. So your solar, utility scale, larger scale solar, wind, as well as natural gas. So nuclear is in there. I don't necessarily count that. There's actually not a cost bar for it, so it's not included in my announced projects. Well, maybe I'll come back to nuclear a little bit later in the presentation. But so I want to talk about just kind of dig into this a little bit, use some examples here to kind of help walk through a thought exercise of why some of these resources might or might not get picked. So lay out a few assumptions for you before I put the cost numbers in comparison to you. So again, this is from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They have an annual technology baseline, 2022. The discount rate came from them. It's a very specific number. That number is probably higher today than it was in 2022. The storage technologies that I'll show you, there is a component for fuel. That fuel cost for storage is the charging cost. And I've assumed a flat $20 per megawatt hour to charge those options up at an 85% round trip efficiency, meaning we get 85% of the power back out that what we put in to charge it. You don't get 100%. There's no perfect device for that round trip efficiency. Is another sort of great area for technology breakthrough to help us on the cost of things like storage. We talk about hydrogen a little bit compared to natural gas. The turbines burning natural gas, hydrogen, there could be differences in performance efficiency of the burning, the conversion of that to electricity. For now, for simplicity's sake, I'm assuming it's performing the same whether it's burning natural gas or hydrogen. No degradation or otherwise difference in how it would produce, the cost of how it would produce it, other than the input cost. So you'll see that there's a big difference. Also, hydrogen, the storage and delivery infrastructure, I am not accounting for other than to say where it's the delivered cost of it. I'll provide the number there. But suffice it to say, we can't just simply change out natural gas pipelines and put in hydrogen and make no other changes and it'll all be fine. The hydrogen is a different molecule than natural gas. You're talking about brand new pipelines, brand new storage, et cetera, significant infrastructure just in the delivery for hydrogen. So what that is a very complicated, and we don't have a broad hydrogen delivery network. So there's a lot of just simple to just assume it gets there, but there's a lot of complications with that, let me say. So today, when we think about that period of time, 6 to 10 o'clock at night, the most challenging place to provide power to from a reliability standpoint and have it still be green, this is those LCOEs and the components of different technologies going from left to right on the screen. Nuclear, then you've got natural gas, two different options, combined cycle, simple cycle, then a simple cycle gas or a simple cycle turbine on 100% hydrogen. And then you got 4-hour and 10-hour storage. You might think of that as 4-hour storage as your lithium ion and 10-hour as like a pumped storage facility. You can see maybe 3 different color coding stacks in each column. Those are components of capital. This is you're financing the cost to build the infrastructure over an assumed book life. So I've specified those book lives for each technology, for each stack. You've got O&M. This is if the capital is like your mortgage costs for your house, the O&M would be what's my electric utility. If I've got single pane, triple pane windows, I've got a different electric bill. So that O&M operations and maintenance cost, there's difference there. Fuel, I kind of specified or clarified the fuel cost for storage is the cost to charge. Let's see. Again, sorry, I'm trying to explain some of this because there are some sort of just things that I might take for granted. Capacity factor, if you all are familiar with that concept or not. Nuclear, I've got that noted as a 90% capacity factor. You might think of that as how much you're actually producing or utilizing the asset. So 90% versus 20%. 90% of the time, the nuclear facility is producing power versus these other ones, it's only 20% of the time. So then finally, the last thing I'll emphasize here is you can see a significant fuel cost in the 100% hydrogen today. That's assuming $6 per kilogram green hydrogen. Again, that's how do you get to $6? It depends on a lot of things. Can you get to $6? I don't know. It's either way, guess what? It's not in the money today. Nobody without other sort of tax credits or other business drivers is not doing a project 100% green hydrogen. Well, how do we make it look closer? We can test this technology. There is blending options, turbine technology. Today, you can blend hydrogen and natural gas. It's not a 50-50 proposition, 25% hydrogen, 75% natural gas. I think you can, in a lot of different studies, groups will say you can do that level of blending without significant infrastructure sort of rehab or overhauling to get there. In doing that, it brings your fuel cost much closer to that natural gas input. Notice when I transitioned slides here, I did change so you could see the components easier. I did change the y-axis scale. So now I'll go to this. What does this possibly look like in the future? Different policy changes out there that could continue to further drive parity or otherwise attractiveness to something like the hydrogen. On these natural gas options, you can see a new cost component, the carbon dioxide. If we did something like a carbon tax, and this is I think a $40 per ton, just flat per ton of carbon emitted, add that cost into the natural gas options. You have a different efficiency, which is why that's not exactly the same, even though the fuel is the same on the combined cycle versus simple cycle option. DOE has a hydrogen moonshot initiative that within 10 years can 1 gram of hydrogen be $1 per kilogram. So let's assume we get there. If we get to $1 per kilogram for green hydrogen, 100% green hydrogen, this is what this stack looks like. So there's a lot of sort of assumptions, maybe some hopes and dreams, technology breakthrough, whatever, but you can see how some of those assumptions matter to relative attractiveness here, which also separates from, time of when the energy is being produced, the location, can we deliver it from wherever it's being located? But some of those things, you can see how it becomes an interesting discussion now when you start to bring in some of these considerations. So zooming a little bit out from a more macro level, there are a variety of studies. We will help utilities, individual utilities, even larger market footprints. So this is a summary of ISO New England. If you all are familiar with that, they had a study recently, future grid reliability. I can share a link with it. There's a public report out there, but suffice it to say, if we look at some of the statistics they looked at where do we go, how do we get to a fully decarbonized grid by 2040, not even 20 years from today. What does that look like? They are currently a multi-state footprint, 25 gigawatts. It's a relatively small, that's less than half the size or the demand of Texas, of ERCOT. SPP, which is in the Midwest, Kansas City is in the SPP market, also double that. So this is a relatively small market, but you do have access to a variety of diverse technologies, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, maybe not as good there as it is in some of the South, but so it's a good sort of representative, albeit small scale. Where they're at today, you can see almost half of their capacity, whether or not it's generating or not, comes from gas. Sorry, the legend didn't get expanded enough here so that you can see all of the technologies there. But to suffice it to say, there's while they get a lot of carbon-free energy out of all that capacity, they have a variety of technology options there to serve where they're at today. By 2040, they want to get to 100% clean energy. What does that look like? So if we compare, and they had a couple different portfolios, supply portfolios that compared what would that look like? And so the one portfolio, and I don't think that this was their words, what I call it the go heavy green, right? Like they just retire all of the fossil generation and go with all your green technologies to get to 100% by 2040. What does that look like? And so I think when you look at this and the scale of this, this is in megawatts, the y-axis there. Where they're at today, they're just shy of 7,000 megawatts of wind, solar storage capacity on their grid. In 20 years, that needs to expand to 90,000 megawatts. So all of those different technologies to meet that future load, including electrification of heating, some of those other things that's going to drive load growth. This, you can see this, and I would say extrapolate this to anywhere else. And this is, again, that when I talk about exponential cost, when we get to 100%, you need to have a variety of technologies that can produce, and then you also have to be able to manage balancing it to demand and deliver it where it's needed. Using the 2022 NREL numbers that I showed cost previously, the composition of this portfolio, the incremental generation capacity added up to $160 billion, just the generation infrastructure. Now, if they were to retain 3,000 megawatts, if this isn't quite 100,000 there, but if it's easier math, round numbers, if we said that was 3%, if it was 100,000 megawatt fleet, we're talking about 3% of that dispatchable. And again, dispatchable meaning we can turn it on and off when needed, whenever needed. And this gets to that small window that I was talking about, that 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night. Having something like that 3,000 megawatts would allow a market and a footprint like ISO New England to bring on that energy when it's needed. I haven't costed out what the cost of that 3,000, because if it's dispatchable but emissions free, well, guess what? Nuclear isn't necessarily dispatchable. It is emission free. We can talk about carbon capture on gas plants or whatever it is, right? But the value of that means we could reduce the investment needed in wind, solar, and storage from 90,000 to 70,000 in round numbers. So we're reducing that investment need from 160 billion to 120 billion. $40 billion in 2022 dollars is the value of that 3,000 megawatts that's more than what it would cost to put in nuclear plants at today's cost sort of. So this is when those crazy ideas, even from a cost standpoint, all of a sudden math can still pencil out when you look at this. One last thing, and I didn't know exactly where this fits in the supply discussion, but I think it's interesting to also note that, and again, this is, I think, whether or not climate change, wherever your stance is, if weather is changing and severe weather is becoming a more frequent event, statistics bear out that maybe we've seen more weather-related outages to the power grid over the last several years. So the blue line, if you're able to see that, which the top line there tracks from DOE sources to the last 20 years, weather events are 75% of the outages related to the grid. And so it's an increasing trend. I find it sort of interesting and challenging then to also think about if we are talking about adding resources that are dependent on the weather, whether wind blowing, sun shining, what have you, and throw severe weather into the mix. I don't know that we're fully sort of contemplating the sort of insurance premiums we might be willing to pay to factor in severe weather into our weather-related supply resources. We're planning, all those numbers are probably rosy, planning assumptions around weather over the next 20 years. And I think it's going to be different. There's going to be challenges there that I don't know, adds to the cost side of this discussion. All right, so now I'll talk a little bit about the delivery infrastructure. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Princeton University. They commissioned a Net Zero America study. This came out at the end of 2020. A quote in there that really resonated with me, that also just is some of the same things I was talking about from a delivery infrastructure, but I think it just puts it into numbers. Maybe as an engineer and an MBA, I can appreciate it. The grid we have today, approximately 150 years to build the grid we have today. To get to this net zero projection by 2050, we're talking about tripling, building this grid 3 times over in the next, not even 30 years, which speaks to the urgency of the timeline. We've got to deal with transmission. We're talking about multi-state footprints in some case. We've got to get everybody to agree, get everybody on board. This is one of those areas where I just see, the challenges of this being, it's fine, it's all fine and dandy if it's all self-contained within a single state, but now we bring in multiple states. You've got different parts of the country where neighboring states have very different views of what the impact of carbon and how it should be accounted for in planning. So just the delivery infrastructure, it's going to cross state boundaries, and that's going to add complexity to this whole situation. If you've been following the industry, and I think one of the things you might have heard about is this sort of logjam in the interconnection queue. So this is a graphic showing and why is there a logjam? There's a lot of different technologies that are looking to interconnect to the grid. And you can see this across different market footprints. I don't know how well you can see it. I did try to give some geographic, definition of what is PJM. You can see the PJM column. What does PJM mean? If you have the slides, I think you can maybe see it easier on your screen if you care to look at this later. But another interesting thing, if you see the solid black lines on in some of these regions, that is the sort of the peak demand of those regions. So you see places like PJM in 2020, they had just in that year interconnection requests for generation capacity that was equal to what their peak demand was. So again, that supply and demand imbalance and the need to deliver it wherever it goes, these technologies can't be dispatched on demand. So we're going to have imbalances relative to what the actual customer demand is. But why does that imbalance drive need for delivery infrastructure? One of the things is where the energy is being produced or where it's most efficient to be produced isn't necessarily right where our demand is. So these are a couple maps to just illustrate MISO. If you can see the shaded kind of footprint, those states, that's the general MISO footprint. The dots are size of plants that are either recently retired or planned to be retired in the next few years. So, large baseload type resource, typically like a coal plant. You might think of coal plant retirement. Maybe a little bit harder to see. These green dots are the green energy. What are the resources, regardless of fuel type, in the interconnection queue? Where are they actually located on the grid? So we're not simply, now there is a big push to reuse existing interconnection space. But if you think about a coal plant, there's a coal plant just north of town, right up on the river here, and it's over 1,000 megawatts. We're not going to put 1,000 megawatt wind farm replacing that same single point of interconnection. So these replacement technologies, the energy density and the location of where they go is not right on top of where the existing infrastructure was built out to deliver to. So we're putting in vast amounts of new generation in new locations that are going to drive different delivery patterns, which is going to mean we're going to have to change the delivery infrastructure. This is the SPP footprint, not quite as large as MISO, but same trend and even bigger in terms of the wind that you can see in this footprint. And this is just to show why is some of that. The image on the left is wind speeds. So wind speeds, the higher the wind speed, the more that correlates to better production. And the image on the right is solar installation. So the Southwest, we've seen increased earlier adoption of solar in the Southwest and places like Arizona, California, because it was sunnier versus Maine and places like that. It's not as sunny, you don't get as much solar production there. So all that being said, you can see some of the phenomena of why we're trying to build some of the clean energy where it is. It's a function of where it's windiest, where it's sunniest. And that doesn't necessarily line up with where the demand is. So we're gonna have to build increased delivery network connections to where we're placing the generation and where it needs to be connected to serve customers. A couple different examples. This isn't complete, but and it's a sort of a constantly moving, updating target, but this is a couple examples of different markets, CAISO, SPP, MISO, PJM. You can see at the top, this is just one example of a study where they said, this is how many gigawatts of new generation we need. And then in some cases, they've specified, how does that break down into wind, solar storage, or other? You can see the breakdown of that total generation. And then that generation, depending on where you cite it, what does it mean in transmission investment? TX is shorthand for transmission. So CAISO recently had a 20-year outlook that said they need 30.5 billion in transmission to facilitate delivery of 120 gigawatts of new generation. I'm talking about just the wires, not the 120 gigawatts of new generation capacity. That's also billions of dollars, if we remember my ISO New England example. Just on the 10-year, in the last 2 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks, CAISO came out with an announcement of a little over 6 billion needed to help facilitate offshore wind storage, some of those things on a 10-year time horizon. MISO, they have a long-range transmission planning process. They've identified 2 tranches of transmission. The first tranche was 10.4 billion. The second tranche is 23 billion. They're expected to identify up to 4 tranches of delivery infrastructure. These are all, and this is, so I've got a lot of question marks, things that are not filled in, and a lot of things could change based on assumptions you make. Again, another example here from NREL, looking at if we build out more transmission across different markets, across these seams, there's a couple different design concepts from an AC transmission basis, even a DC basis, which is more, DC is going to be more point to point. You can see these different concepts, the summary of them, we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of miles of transmission and tens of billions of dollars in each one of these design concepts. None of this was included in these previous numbers, right? So at the end of the day, I'm sorry, this didn't get formatted correctly, but we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in delivery network on top of the supply needed. So if you're familiar with the Southern Spirit is a proposed project in connecting in and around Houston, Texas, over east into Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama area. $2 billion is an estimated price tag for it. The value of having something like that when Winter Storm Uri, which was, if we remember, that was, a large significant outage down in Texas, but broad swaths of the country were impacted by it. ERCOT had billions of dollars in market costs associated with shortage of energy supply. Still dealing with, I think, some of the financial repercussions of that. But this proposed $2 billion transmission line would have paid for itself in 4 days during that event if you could have sourced more power outside of ERCOT on this one transmission line. A lot of dollars. Okay, so let me wrap up and then see if there's any questions. So suffice it to say, if you take one thing away from what I've shared with you, what I've talked about today, getting anywhere close to 100% is going to require significant infrastructure investment on both a power supply standpoint as well as a delivery. We're talking about trillions of dollars. Now, caveat that with that's based on today's technologies. So we can be open-minded to there will be technology breakthroughs and things that are not commercially on the radar today, but these are not things that are going to show up inside of 10 years from now. So we're also running out of time if we think we're gonna hit this by 2050 and have new technology that helps us get there win the day with lower cost. We're running out of time to see that actually help us get there. Federal policy or just getting on the same page as far as what are we gonna do, I think matters. That we've seen a lot of policy around that, significant sums of dollars going into the clean energy space, whether it's the IRA, the IIJA, some of these recent acts are things that are showing sort of interest and momentum behind different technologies that will sustain investment and build up of their supply chain, et cetera. But those are things that are going to take a while to get to a point of bringing the costs down. But suffice it to say, I think even on some of the emerging technologies, and this gets to a little bit of the third point there, but things like technologies like nuclear energy is sort of an interesting and not cheap technology, but it is a proven technology and it is emission free. If we are going to get to 100%, you've got to have a diverse set of technologies more than what we have available to us today to get there. And if we don't invest in things like nuclear, that workforce is going to age out and go away. And it's going to be more expensive to have to train the next wave or build something new. We got to figure out what we're going to do with nuclear as a policy example versus wind, solar. We've got to diversify what else is there to serve that energy need. Electrification of other sectors. This is just going to exacerbate sort of the challenges that we're just talking about, changing out the demand and the consumer as they are today. Now let's electrify transportation. Let's electrify heating. Let's electrify agriculture. These are things that are going to drastically change the demand profiles of what the industry sees today and increase the demand. Let alone that's just converting from one fuel type to electricity. If we also talk about things like data centers, hydrogen, these are significant load growths like the industry has not seen. There's public information out there, utility that we work with down in Arizona that serves the Phoenix area, for example, not a small city, right? Their load growth driven by data centers today they serve 4 or 5% of their energy on an annual basis goes to data centers. They're talking about within 15, 16 years, having 50% of their energy going to data centers. So that's the rest of the city didn't disappear to do that. We're talking about, total, those things are significant challenges to this, along with inflation. How are we going to pay for all of this? How are we going to raise rates to be able to have a balance sheet to deal with all of the debt and everything else? Those also don't happen immediately, and consumers aren't going to be able to just pay, and we're not talking about doubling your bills. I think we're, in a different stratosphere. And then how do we spread that out? I don't have all the answers to that. I'm not going to opine on that, but suffice it to say that there's a lot to be done over the next several decades, and it's not going to be simple or easy.
Thank you, Matt. I want to open this up to the floor for questions from the associate members. I know we're over time here, so I want to ask people to make their comments quick, and Matt, when you respond, if you could make your answer quick too. So who do we have on the associate members? Paul Cicio on the line, I think.
Yeah, hey, Matt, great presentation. A couple quick points. I'm glad that you're sensitive to the issue of costs. I represent industrial manufacturers. We are very cost sensitive. The fact is that electricity price inflation is already here. Today, the Consumer Price Index, 12 months running, it just was released. Electricity price inflation at 5%. And that's 40% higher than the Consumer Price Index of 3.5% increase. Food was 2.5% as a result, also an additional data point. So my point is, we are already, as consumers, experiencing accelerating electricity price inflation. And this is an important point. We believe it's driven by these transmission costs. And another perspective is that, as we all know, natural gas prices are very, very low. So we're in that price and inflation number is a very low natural gas power generation cost. Point number two, you mentioned the Princeton University study, which is commonly used in the transmission build out debate. And the number that I took away from that study is that it will take $2.1 trillion between now and 2050 to build out that transmission grid that you were just talking about. Third point, you mentioned data centers, but I'd like to add to this. The injection of the data centers changes the demand profile. Right now, manufacturers is the only sector that runs 24/7 demand. And you're correct, massive growth in demand center demand going forward. That is high quality demand, just like manufacturers. And when you have high demand, 24/7 demand, and you have a lot of intermittent resources, there's potential problems, as you have alluded to. So those are my 3 points. Good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If I need to respond to any of that, or if we keep going, I think all great points. And again, I think cost is an underappreciated issue in this whole discussion. One thing that I do think is sort of also, if we keep in mind, when we are replacing things like natural gas based or coal based resources with things like wind, solar, et cetera, that fuel cost component and even the O&M components are almost wiped away. There is no fuel cost associated with wind or solar, but you could almost replace that with a need for investment in the wires. So our fuel cost could go to transmission investment, and that might wash out, and we might be at the same level of cost overall. So there's things like that there is an opportunity to try to fit in some additional investment, but it is going to take a significant investment, and rate pressure will be here for some time. And even I'll say data centers, not just data centers, some of the geopolitical challenges, tensions that you see out there, the value in local supply chains, onshoring manufacturing. So it's not just data centers. We might onshore more commercial and industrial processes that were otherwise being done elsewhere, that now we're doing those, bringing those back onshore for a variety of reasons, low cost natural gas, et cetera. So I don't know, a lot of trade-offs to balance out in this whole thing.
Yes, first of all, I want to comment. I think that the presentation was excellent. It was very fulsome, and I particularly appreciated the attention that was given to the transmission system. Prior to my time as a financial services lawyer, I was a utility lawyer and spent a lot of time with transmission engineers and generation engineers. And so the complexity that you brought to bear, is really, really checked a lot of boxes, and I appreciated that. I think for purposes of this committee, I think we should pay attention. Something that we should be thinking about is the impact on the hedging market. If all this infrastructure is being brought to bear into the market, if new transmission is being brought to bear into the market, what is the consequence for, long-term hedges of, assets that are being developed, whether it's renewable, or conventional, because there will be implications for, the costs, the transmission congestion, the basis differentials within markets, hub to hub, or between different RTOs, ISOs. And I think there might be implications relative to the appetite for the folks that are hedging some of these projects to enter into long-term hedges, because there may be a consequence on the pricing and the sort of the orderly transition and transparency of the market. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm going to encourage you to answer quickly, if I may.
I guess I think there's just hedging with historical transmission or historical price differences between markets is something that is going to change with new transmission build out, where that's going to be added, how that's going to be added, predicting that. But also, I think just protecting against those changes is, I don't know, I guess I would say, I think it's a good point, and it's subject to a lot of speculation where or how you might effectively do it, I guess, in the future.
Frank, I think I saw your card next.
Excellent presentation. Thank you. Thank you for coming and speaking to the committee. The question I have is that, you know, I thought you did a really good job laying out all the infrastructure, log jam, shortfalls. Have you done any work in regards to the trading around that to mitigate those associated risk? And what type of trades they are? And if you have, if you would be willing to kind of share that with the committee, perhaps on a future date. As opposed to right now. But have you looked at that at all, just out of curiosity?
Trading, I don't know if you can be more specific in terms around the.
Well, everything from, you know, how you hedge the basis risk to how you hedge the fact that you may have congestion that you're dealing with, to how, you know, you ultimately could be dealing with the price risk associated with the weather storm, and how it kind of relates to the overall development of products, standardizations, trading activity to mitigate this, because clearly we're looking at a shortfall of infrastructure in the short run. I mean, you could make that short run 50 years, you make that short run 2 years, but you're going to have a shortfall of infrastructure. And so you have to figure out, well, is there a commercial OTC derivative type trading solution available to market participants to mitigate those types of risk? And if there were, or if there are, what would those instruments be, and how do you foresee them being deployed in the market today, given the slate of products out there?
Yeah, I mean, so some of that I think just comes down to what are the settlement locations. Different markets have, I would say, more mature, defined sort of settlement locations that are sort of, I think, accepted and contracted around. What does the contract look like? Who's willing to bear more risk on where that settlement location is, where you're delivering versus consuming the power? Those are things that I think are evolving based on also the sophistication of the participants that need to buy it. I think there's also an interesting aspect of tax credits versus tax appetite. Public utilities can't monetize tax credits in the same way that third parties can. That some of that is also maybe being on a more parity basis. So you might have more utility owned, so they might take on the risk. There's a lot of things, sorry, I'm trying to
think about though. I mean, I think that everything from a unit contingency type option to something to deal with ingestion risk or node-to-node type transactions is really, you know, some of the innovation the market participants are thinking about, and how to get around these current limitations that are being presented given the current structure of the energy transition.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know who is taking on more risk, depending on how liquid the counterparties are when you're doing this too. It's also, I think there's a lot there that we're not maybe seeing that risk manifest just yet, but it could be there's a significant event.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Paul?
And I'll be quick. Thanks for a great presentation. Thanks for laying out effectively another Monday at work. And I can't emphasize enough the affordability piece. I've said this in your, 50% of our rate base makes $50,000 a year less. And you talk about those costs, we're talking about a fraction. So you lay that on with the rapid demand we're seeing. We're seeing it. You've seen our press releases of our operating companies. We're making multiple, requests to build more infrastructure. My question for you is, do you see is the value of optionality? Do you see optionality areas where we can explore optionality as we kind of move forward? Because right now this isn't three-dimensional chess. It's like three-dimensional whack-a-mole. We are like doing so many things so many times. I no longer say fleet transition, because we're not transitioning. We're just trying to survive with the demand that's coming. I'm hearing a lot more talk about extending the lives of existing units than I am about, hey, we're transitioning to this. because I can't keep up with the move to the electrification. It's almost like we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Now, my question to you is, do you see, and when you've looked at all this, do you see opportunities for optionality? Because it seems like optionality value is also skyrocketing if we find where that is.
Yeah, I agree. I think, talk about just the value of diverse technologies. It is very important, but I think the challenge in those conversations is around, you can paint a picture of the value of an option, but it's predicated on these other assumptions, X, Y, and Z, and what's the probability? And again, how much are we willing to pay for this insurance premium? We need it, we value it when we need it, but if we don't need it, why do we pay for it? You know, not everybody is willing. And then when you throw in the affordability discussion, so I think that optionality, the value of the options is greater. It's when you, all the uncertainty that's out there, it's gotta be important. So maintaining, I think things like leveraging the existing infrastructure to the greatest extent possible. So looking at things like carbon capture, reusing existing infrastructure gives you an option, helps you utilize existing infrastructure, try to minimize new investment, but you're still gonna need new investment too.
And this is an industry that does not like to invest before they have certainty of return.
No, and you're not, it's not to your benefit, it's not to your customer's benefit.
Melinda?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be very brief. Thank you very much for the presentation. I very much like and agree with it. I'll echo Paul's comments, and that, you know, this energy transition, we can't focus enough on how much it's going to cost the consumer at the end of the day. You know, we serve 70 public power utilities from coast to coast, and there are various different economic price points, so to speak. But it is definitely, it is a very stressful time. I'm not seeing as many nuclear permitting as you would like, given that the goal is to be green. I do think that's a critical component that we need to look at. I do see the extension of like the licenses. We have a couple of clients that have done that on their nuclear units, and we have a client that's built nuclear units in the recent past, but I don't think many others have. It's just too cost prohibitive. But anyway, just want to say thank you. It's a great presentation. I'll follow with the rest of my questions offline.
I'm going to turn now, I think, to the EMAC members. Do I see a hand up, Tyson?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for the super comprehensive presentation. Just a quick point of clarification. There is no federal rule or mandate requiring 100% electricity by any date. In fact, there's no federal rule or mandate for any percentage of electricity generation. So what you've outlined is purely for hypothetical and discussion purposes and not in response to any sort of national federal rule or mandate.
Yeah, correct. There's no federal, there's a variety of state or otherwise, like, you know, individual utility or corporation, but again, kind of when we get to paying for all those investments, if you're going to a state commission, if you're regulated by a state commission, that you don't have that mandate, it's going to be an interesting discussion. That's what I would say.
I have a quick question, but before that, I would actually argue that the IRA and the other subsidizations are in fact a national mandate through a backdoor by propping up certain parts of new energy options and penalizing, thereby penalizing other options that represent a diversification of energy resources. My question is, have you done any work to assist consumers in understanding what the utilities and others are going through from a cost perspective and how it might affect them? It seems to me that all of what we're doing is sitting in an ivory tower, talking about costs, et cetera. And I'm not sure that consumers really know how it's going to impact them. And frankly, they're the ones with the vote and the ability to say, no, I'm not paying more. Thank you very much. Because it's going to come from them at the end of the day. And if you haven't done any such education, are you willing to partner with folks who do consumer education on energy issues?
Yeah, so the closest thing to that, and I would say it is consumer education. we work with a lot of utilities directly in their integrated resource planning process. Many of those have a stakeholder component to it. So there's public meetings, transparency around what are the models we're using to determine a power supply portfolio. What is the cost assumptions that go into that? We facilitate, we will help, do some of that analysis and have those discussions. I think getting the public sort of wrapped around, I think this is where we struggle as engineers we just talk about how complex and complicated this is, and the political realm and the soundbite, everybody wants to hear a 30-second soundbite and not really appreciate all of the things. It's like, well, yeah, you could get there, but it's, all of a sudden, all those buts, and people are just like, well, I heard this 10 years ago when you said you couldn't deal with 20% wind, and you did that no problem. Now I don't want to hear it, or there's a little bit of deception around how easy or not, or how cheap or not. And so I think we can all agree that if we can do something that's environmentally responsible at an affordable price point, we would all say, yes, let's do it. But the reality is how much, and we're not talking about a doubling your bill, we're talking about 20x, some outlandish number. And if people put that in front of, but the problem is you've got utilities have made commitments to say, we're gonna go green. If they say this is gonna cost 20 times what the non-green option is, and then they go to their commission and say, can I get approval to spend it? It's not gonna work either. So it's an interesting time to try to deal with it. I would be willing to talk further. My wife's a school teacher. I'm passionate about how do we get the word out there and help people appreciate and understand this, and let's make decisions with eyes wide open to the challenges. And that's why I love this it doesn't have to be a political area. It's just, what is the cost? What does this look like? And let's get that information out there and help people make decisions from there.
I'll send you a note.
Jackie, I think you get the final word from the EMAC members today.
All right. I just came from spending 3 days with PJM and State Commission. And I've got to tell you, these are very serious. I guess I can make this into a question, but these are very serious times in the energy business. We are really trying to figure out how we're going to get through the next 5 years and be reliable and resilient, much less going to clean energy. And that problem has been driven by baseload retirements like coal plants, because it's not efficient for them anymore, and the coming onto the system of a lot of intermittent resources. PJM has, thousands of megawatts, gigawatts in their queue, interconnection queue. Most of it is intermittent resources. Most of those don't make it through the queue. Maybe 20% make it through the queue. And we can't fill that gap between retirements and current demand, especially with the data centers going in. It's a real problem. And manufacturers are starting to go off system. They do co-located load on their property behind lines because they can't pay the costs anymore. And this is in the context of transmission owners not being willing and actually fighting at the RTOs for not having to do things like effective load carrying capabilities, where their lines may have much more capability to transmit electricity than PJM is assuming, but they don't want to fix that because of economics. And then finally, the final disturbing context is if you listen to the SEC earnings calls, and I listen to First Energy and AEP there in West Virginia, and they're using transmission to drive earnings. That is their goal. Our earnings are going to be fine because we're going to build transmission, whether you need it or not. Baseline projects at PJM were enormously expensive. Now that they've tapered off, the state-controlled supplemental projects which they have more control over, are expanding at astronomical rates.
And we're looking at customers not being able to afford electricity now with these increased costs, much less if we go to zero carbon. And I will say, to the extent you think it's not a serious problem with grid, in Winter Storm Elliott and PJM, we were a whisper away from the grid going down, a whisper away. And there were a lot of reasons for it. Most of them were generators not being prepared to turn on their generation. And the economics around that have to change, but this is a real serious issue. So,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, 100% agree. Reliability, affordability, and sustainability. You can't have all three of those be low, pick two. You want reliability and green, well, affordability is gonna suffer.
To Paul's point of surviving, I just want to thank everyone and that's all I will say as we wrap up this meeting. Thank you.
I think this concludes the work of EMAC today, and we thank all the members and the associate members for the lively conversations today. And I'm looking forward to the ongoing work of this committee and our next meeting date for later in this year, and maybe another art history lesson to come along with that. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren.
No, just thank you to everyone. I don't know, 7, 8 meetings in and we still can't get the time right, early, late, whatever. I think it's really great. Like every meeting is better than the last in terms of engagement and interest. So super excited about that. But yeah, we will just be on the lookout for next meeting details. Like I said, it will likely be in the summer and it'll likely just be around the report. But who knows, things could change. Maybe we'll do another tour somewhere before the end of the summer. With that, this meeting is adjourned.